This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. A little best of today. 4 episodes from my archive. Brad Feld, venture capitalist. Vincent Bevins, an author, talking about some actions America took in the 1960s that you probably don't know about. Alexander Osterwalder, a great book that doesn't start with words. And finally, Mike Dever, the first episode on this show. Now, this is not his first appearance on the show. It's a later appearance, but he was my first guest. Without any further delay, let's jump right into 4 really interesting, bright men. I hope you enjoy this episode. This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. This is one of those fun conversations you only get to have by doing a podcast. My guest today is Brad Feld. He's an American entrepreneur, author, blogger, venture capitalist at Foundry Group in Boulder, Colorado. While we go back in time, Brad's got a few years on me, just a handful of years, pretty close in age, but it was really fun to dig through his tech experience. Mid-'80s, coming into the early 90s, Netscape taking off, all of his different experiences. Wow, what a great time travel, and bringing it all up to current day. The synthesis of the whole, the philosophical underpinnings. It's always my fun, and hopefully the guests' fun, to get into an entrepreneurial conversation, the entrepreneurial thinking, the entrepreneurial love. And for Brad, his big thing, startup communities. Startup communities wherever you are, whatever city you are in. Start a startup community. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my conversation with Brad Feld. Take me back in time, because I would have to think I was a pretty average student. And I would think you were either a really good student or you just got 800 on the SATs, because a lot of kids were not running off to MIT. What's the story?
I was a smart, precocious kid. I was in the group that was the honors, or today the IB, International Baccalaureate crowd, or whatever it was. But I was also pretty athletic. I wasn't just sort of cloistered in the corner, but all my friends were the sort of smart kids in high school. But I didn't like the work that we ended up all having in those years. And that was basically working in a food court at a shopping mall, or working in a retail store in a shopping mall, or doing something like that. I got fired from a couple of jobs because I was a really oppositional employee. I ended up tutoring for the math SAT. When I was a junior, I started tutoring, and instead of getting paid $3 an hour, which was minimum wage back then, I got paid $30 an hour. That was kind of an enlightening moment for me. The other was that there was a lot of demand for my tutoring services. And at some point I decided to limit, because I could only do it about 4 nights a week. I limited it only to girls. And then at some point I decided to limit it only to girls who were seniors.
What a gig.
It was a good gig. It's a story worth telling in this context of like what it was like. Was there was already, when I was in high school, this sort of entrepreneurial sense. A lot of it was sort of independence, but it was applying something that I was good at and then getting better at it. Because, of course, the point is if you tutor for a year for the SAT and then you take it, well, you've actually been sort of studying for a year, which is way more than you have to study to get a perfect score on the math SAT. That was my high school. I mean, I was a pretty normal, comfortable, upper middle class life in Dallas, Texas. I did have one element of other in my growing up, which is I was in a very large high school, I don't know, a couple thousand kids, and I was one of 4 Jewish kids in the high school. There were very few of us that were Jewish. I wasn't religious, but I had a religious identity even as a kid of growing up with that. So there was definitely a sense of the other in that because we had funny holidays and I didn't get to participate in Christmas or my parents didn't do Christmas. There was some interesting as a smart kid in a comfortable middle class environment, but also having some sense of not being part of what's actually really going on.
Let me keep it at the word incentive for a moment, not to bore you with any of my similar experiences in terms of incentive and selling something and being paid for it. But I want you to speak to that because you brought up the notion of going from $3 an hour to 30. Something happens in your DNA when you realize you can be paid outside of the norm, outside of the system. When you realize, oh, wow, I can go to a completely different place and you don't have to stand in line, so to speak.
It's very perceptive. For me, that first piece of it was the tutoring. The element of that tutoring was I was responsible for my own work and my own business, including, by the way, setting the price. I could have set a higher or lower price, but I talked to some people and tried to figure out what a fair price was. I was fortunate. It didn't just come out of nowhere. My father, who was a doctor, had several patients who were entrepreneurs. 2 of them ended up having a lot of influence on me. One, a guy named Gene Scott, probably had the most influence on me. About every couple of months, I would go out to lunch with him and my dad when I was a sophomore and a junior and talk about computers and business. I also, for my bar mitzvah when I was 13, I got an Apple II computer. So I sort of fell in love with computers sort of early on in the personal computer thing. I was seeing other people build little companies from nothing and all of a sudden start selling their software. And so I had a sense of all that. And then my junior year in high school, I went to England for the summer. One of my father's other friends who was an entrepreneur got me a job with a company called Centronics that was at one point still a modest but entrepreneurial product company in the 1982 timeframe. And I spent the entire summer in England, in London, writing software for them. That was very profound for me because I lived alone. I went to London alone. I lived with an older couple, but I kind of was very much alone the whole summer. I made some new friends with the people I worked with. I worked in a professional environment. But even then, the work that I was doing felt pretty entrepreneurial to me. I didn't have that word for it then. And then between my senior year and first year of college, I worked for a husband and wife startup writing oil and gas software. And this was the real trigger for me in a profound way, which is I got paid $10 an hour. I learned pretty quickly that if I worked 80 hours a week, I got paid twice as much as if I worked 40 hours a week. But more importantly was they gave me a 5% royalty on sales of all the software that I wrote. So I wrote 2 products for their company. When I was in college, I would get a check in the mail each month for my royalties on the software. And some months it was $1,000, and some months it was $2,000. And I remember one month it was a little bit over $10,000. I took everybody that I lived with. I lived in a fraternity with about 50 other people. I took them all across the street to a Chinese restaurant for dinner. And we had dinner on me, and I still had $8,000 left. This notion of all of the pieces, not being in a corporate environment, not having somebody tell me, like, this is your job and this is what you need to do. But even in the small, I was the first employee for the 2 husband and wife founders. Their company grew to about 20 people. Was very successful for a while, and sort of experiencing that from the very beginning at a very young age, 18, 19, was very formative for me.
It's funny to hear you say some things. My father, entrepreneurial doctor, in grad school, I ended up going to London alone, kind of on an adventure. There's some parallel things going on here, but I'm thinking of a famous, I don't know if it's famous to me, but there's a famous intro to an Anthony Bourdain episode where he's in Thailand, Chiang Mai, Thailand. And he says that once I got to Asia, Asia ruined me for my old life. what you just described, I imagine you were ruined to ever be kind of the quote employee like everyone else. Once you went through that formative experience, what you just described, you were toast. There was no going back.
That's right. It was just a different frame of reference. And it was almost more than toast. The other frame of reference, the idea of going and working for a large company, really wasn't part of my worldview. It also, I think, gave me comfort as an entrepreneur in dark moments when I was really struggling with my first company in various ways or struggling with a decision. I felt like my downside case was I could always go get a job. I think that came from the idea that I didn't actually want a job. So in some ways it reflected back motivation. Okay, well, I can always go get a job, but I know I really don't want that. So I better go figure out how to make this thing work.
Do you think the experience you describe in your kind of experience of going through life, is there something common amongst entrepreneurs? I mean, it's not something that I imagine you can just show up at a Harvard MBA program at 23, 24 with no real entrepreneurial experience. And then you're, quote, going to learn how to be an entrepreneur from a book. It seems like a tough proposition.
Yeah, there's an age-old endless debate, which is, entrepreneurship innate, or can you learn how to be an entrepreneur? And my answer for many, many years now is yes, that the two things are actually positive and contribute to each other. I have a very close friend, a guy named Jerry Colonna, who runs a coaching firm called Reboot. I think he's the best CEO coach in the world.
Been on this podcast.
All right. So you know Jerry. You can, in the show notes, refer back to him. If you had him on this podcast, you know that the Reboot story is a combination of two things. One is practical skills development, so learning how to get better at things, learning. And the other is radical self-inquiry. And that's this deep exploration into yourself. I love that dichotomy because his view is to be a great leader, and especially if you want to be a great entrepreneur, you need both. You need practical skills development and you need radical self-inquiry. Now, the instantiation of radical self-inquiry around how to learn how to be an entrepreneur, or whether you sort of wake up one day, or what factors influence you, is it innate or is it genetic? I don't know if it's genetic, but is it innate? The influence of my father, huge influence on me. The influence of the couple of my father's friends, huge influence on me. My father not telling me I had to go to London, but encouraging me to go to London that summer and having that experience. Huge influence. My mother, who is an artist, sort of watching her creative act that she took seriously as a job from 9 to 5 every day, Monday to Friday. She was in her studio and she was unavailable to my brother and I, even though she was at home because her studio was upstairs in our house. She was not available. She was at work. The linkage of this creative act of being an artist combined with this rigor and seriousness, along with her own self-discipline and her own sense of self-inquiry about what was important to her, all of those things had huge impact on my innate sense of what I wanted to be and how I wanted to be.
Let me keep it at London for a moment. Was that your first international travel?
It wasn't the first, but I hadn't done a lot. We'd gone to England and Scotland once before. We'd been to Mexico a couple of times, but not much.
What did it do to you, if you can go back to the memories? I can still remember going to London for the first time and all that walking I would do. And I knew every side street in central London. But what did it do to you? What did that experience, what was the superhero power you got from spending that time in London? If you tried to tell somebody today, for example, if I try to tell my sister, hey, send your kids to Vietnam to experience it, and they all get scared. I mean, there's a lot of Americans that still, look, a lot of Americans don't have passports still. There's a lot of Americans that still feel this sense of, I don't want to go do that. It's a little too scary. But when you get over the hump, something magical happens.
I don't know that there was one thing. There was a lot of really powerful things that summer. One is I did spend a lot of time alone. I had a girlfriend, a long distance girlfriend from high school. That was important experience for me to have. I think I was over there for about 8 or 9 weeks, to have that period of time alone and make new friends, but not sort of lose myself in new friends, but end up doing a lot of things by myself. Your comment about wandering around every nook and cranny, that summer, like many summers, the tube went on strike. The London Underground, all of a sudden you couldn't take the Underground anywhere, the tube anywhere. Yeah, I had to take buses everywhere. And I lived in a place called Northfields, which was far west London. And I worked in a place called South Kensington, which was central London. On the tube, it was a relatively straightforward couple of stops one way, a couple stops another way. But on a bus, it was a 2-hour thing. I got a bicycle, so I bicycled sometimes, which for an American London is kind of tricky because everything's going the wrong way. And so all your instincts about how to ride a bike are wrong. Sometimes I'd walk home and I'd have a walk bus home for a couple of hours. And I learned that it was okay. I learned to go into pubs, and I could go into a pub and order dinner and have a beer, because when you're 16 years old and you walk into a pub in England, they give you a beer. I learned how to go to the movies by myself, but I also learned how to do those things with friends. I had a couple of friends that summer that worked with me who were kids in college. And on a weekend or two, one weekend we went to Birmingham, another weekend, I can't remember where we went somewhere north, where they just sort of say, hey, come on, it's Friday afternoon, you're coming with us. And I'd call the people I stayed with and say, hey, look, I'm going with my friends for the weekend. So sort of learned that at a young age and got comfortable with that kind of movement. Two other big ones that really were meaningful to me. The family I lived with, the couple, husband, wife, he was a World War II veteran. He was very sort of prototypical classic, what you would expect from a Londoner World War II veteran from movies or whatever cliches we have. And he was a wonderful, wonderful guy. And we'd have these long conversations. And what I realized was that my lived experience as a teenager in America was totally and completely different from his lived experience as a teenager pre-World War II and now as older person in London. It wasn't that we're talking a different language, we both spoke English, but it was like the actual functional experiences were so far apart. And it gave me a real sense of that versus sort of everybody everywhere kind of is the same. But it did it in a very accessible way. It was English, so we could have these long conversations. And he was very interested because he was retired and he wanted to talk. That was a profound and powerful one for me. The other is, it was the summer of the Falkland War. And I don't know how many people on this podcast are old enough to know the Falkland War, but the Falkland War was a really, really significant thing in contemporary England history. It was actually a war that had people in England. It was very controversial. There was both people that really thought they should do it and people that really thought they shouldn't do it. Unlike the Vietnam War in America, which of course I've been learning about in high school, which was a huge extended number of people and tons of deaths, the Falkland Islands are this tiny little thing. Right? It's like an irrelevant piece of land.
Nowhere close to the UK.
Just irrelevant. And it was just sort of nationalistic egotism around a thing. And just sort of settling into that very early on was powerful for me because it created a perspective around conflict. Did I really care what happened with the Falkland War? Not really. But all of a sudden, as a 16-year-old, every night on the news, I'm hearing about it. Every morning in the paper, I'm reading about it. As I'm sitting on the bus and I buy my paper for 10 pence or whatever the papers were back then, all of a sudden I'm immersed in this nationalistic phenomena, which, by the way, of course, in the United States in 2020, we're living through a whole bunch of nationalistic debate and conflict. It was powerful to me to help me understand how much human energy, in my mind, is actually wasted on that kind of thing, which I view as very non-productive. That was powerful early on in my life versus sort of coming to it later.
I got to share one really quick just from my own memory. But I remember one of my favorite things walking around London. I knew every street, like I said. And I remember one day I was probably in one of those black trench coats with my Doc Martens on, and some little old lady walked up to me and she wanted directions. I knew exactly where she wanted to go, all the street turns. And she hears my American accent and she's just gruffed at me. She's like, you don't know what you're talking about. I walked away. I was like, I know exactly where you want to go. She heard that accent. She was like, no way. You don't know what you're talking about. Listen, let me take you from that kind of period that you're describing into the early to mid 90s. So I actually left my one grad semester in London in 94. So I got back to the States in mid 94 and it was AOL disk time. What were you doing at that time? Because you had an early start thinking about your life and you had an early start to kind of know that these things were going to unravel as they did leading up to the Netscape IPO in summer of 95, or did you not? You must have been seeing these things a little bit more close than the average person.
Well, yes, and I sort of just lived in them. I started my first company in 1987 when I was still in college. I started with a partner. We didn't raise any money because we didn't have any money and we didn't even know what it meant to raise money. So we just bootstrapped the business. From 87 to 93, we built a business that wrote software mostly for small and medium-sized businesses back when it was really, really hard to write software. that worked on more than one computer and actually worked in a network and actually did anything on personal computers. We took a very computer science approach to business applications. We built a nice company that was very consistently profitable for 7 years because it had to be. We had no money. We were both young. We learned a ton about business. We both knew a lot about computers, but we were on that wave of personal computers that shifted from DBase and Paradox and database languages, and then real languages like C and Pascal, but where you really couldn't build meaningful business applications easily with those languages. We shifted from that through client server computing, sort of Windows and graphical based computing with all the early adopter challenges. We sold the business in 93, and 94 was the beginning of the commercial internet. I remember the first time I saw a web browser. I knew the internet. I'd been sending email for many years and an email account on the MIT internet when I went to college. MIT had an internal network infrastructure called Project Athena that got launched when I was in college and became a thing sort of in the 80s. I was around the internet, but I kind of thought of it as something separate from my business application end user PC world. One day after I'd sold my company, people started coming up to me. I was sort of in the MIT community, some undergraduates and other people that were interested in their businesses. And I had a bunch of friends in Boston, of course, that were also entrepreneurs. So there was kind of a nice network around that. I started spending some time looking at some stuff other than focusing just on my business. And a couple of undergrads came up to me and took me out to lunch. Actually, the one that prompted it was a guy named Raj Bhargava, who today is still an extremely close friend. And we've done about 8 businesses together. Raj came up to me and said, "Can I take you out to lunch? I want to talk about this new thing that we're doing with some of my friends." I said, "Sure." So we went out to lunch, him and a guy, Matt Cutler, who also is CEO of a company now called Block Native that we're investors in that's doing stuff in and around blockchain. The two of them described to me the World Wide Web. We had a nice lunch and we talked about entrepreneurship and they were kind of getting to know me. And I said, "Can I see it? Can you show it to me?" Didn't really know what that meant. And they said, "Sure." So we went to the MIT Student Center. At the time was on the second floor of the MIT Student Center building where they had a big computer cluster. And on probably was a Sun workstation, they showed me a very early version of Mosaic as a browser running the World Wide Web with an application that they had been involved in doing called Freshman Fish Wrap. And what Freshman Fish Wrap was like a daily newspaper of stuff going on at MIT. It wasn't the official daily student newspaper. There was a separate one, but this was a really crappy web browser version of it. And it had links, and you click on a link and it went to some other page. This time there were very, very few websites, probably 100 websites. It was remarkable. You have that moment and you're like, oh yeah, all this stuff I've been doing for the last 7 years, it's going to take a long time for this technology, the user interface, and sort of all the tools to kind of catch up. There is no way that people are going to be limited the way we've been limited so far with PCs and with client server computing once all of this stuff gets going. So from 1994 forward, I would say I've just been deeply immersed in this evolutionary wave of many, many things around technology and computers, but with that sort of start with the rise of the commercial internet.
Selling your biz at that point in time, your first one, did that put you in a situation where you felt a certain secureness? Because I guess you're late 20s, early 30s at the latest.
28.
Did you have a sense at that moment in time in terms of money? Looked ahead and you said, oh, I feel secure for many, many years ahead. I can take more chances now. Did you have that sense?
Maybe, maybe not. I was 28 after tax and after all the incentives from the public company that bought ours. And when that company got bought, I made somewhere $1.5 million, $2 million. That was the amount of money. So that was plenty of money. But our company had been very profitable. It was a smallish company. It was only about a $2 million a year revenue company, but we made $250,000 to $500,000 a year of profit each year. We had plenty of cash moving through the business, although of course, anybody that runs a closely held business knows that you pay much of that back in taxes. The actual amount that you're banking each year is not that much. And then you have cash flow dynamics of a business like that. So you're constantly kind of managing cash flow. But even through all that period, as we were building this business from the two of us forward, I always felt financial abundance. I didn't grow up with a bunch of money. Again, my dad was a doctor, so we had a comfortable life. And my parents didn't hand us money. My parents paid for my undergrad, but I paid for all my grad school. I had financial independence from an early age. Getting those checks in college, people didn't get much money in college. And I don't know, my freshman year, I probably made $40,000 from royalty checks and from working for that company. So for a long time, my feeling of financial abundance was ahead of my personal spending. I've tried to modulate my life that way all the way through so that I've never felt any real stress around the cost structure of my life relative to the money I had. Interestingly, when I sold that business in 1993, I promised, let's say had $2 million in the bank after that company got bought, about just to have a number. I made a promise to my wife, Amy, that I would never have less than $100,000 in the bank. That was the level of base that we felt like we needed. We bought a house, and then I took the rest of the money and invested it over the next 3 years in 40 startups. 40. About one a month over 3 years. Sometimes I'd do two in a month. Sometimes I wouldn't do any. So I did a lot of investments, $25,000 and $50,000 at a time, all at the very beginning. I helped start a couple of companies. I remember having to tell Amy that we had less than $100,000 in the bank because I had invested another $25,000 in something. And all of a sudden, I had basically invested almost all of the money I'd made from that first sale into startups. Now, this was 94, 95, 96. By 97, the internet had really taken off and the returns started to come. So very quickly, that investment had very meaningful positive financial returns. Bank account built back up pretty quickly. But it was this interesting dynamic where I had a little bit, of course, when you have $2 million in the bank, your brain probably shifts some in terms of how you relate to it. My brain probably shifted some. But at the same time, I was perfectly comfortable investing all of it with a very little buffer because I was confident that, again, my worst case is I could get a job, but I knew how to, at that point, start a company, run a company, build a company. Like I knew that if I needed to go back to what I was doing for my first company, I could at least have a good living.
You mentioned 1994 being a pivotal year, but I would think summer of 95, when Netscape went public, that was something entirely different. And I remember feeling it, and I was nowhere close to doing what you were doing in any way, shape, or form. I mean, I was hiring a Russian programmer to build a 4-page website in 1996 for $4,000. That was still different for most people. But when Netscape went public, that was this game on moment. And I sometimes wonder today, and you can kind of go both ways where I'm going here. You can talk about how Netscape affected you. But I also look at today that I think a lot of young kids today don't have that chance to feel that sense of excitement of like, man, the internet's taking off. Wow, look what Andreessen's doing. This is crazy. I'm so excited. Whereas a lot of kids today probably just read a story about a bunch of VCs in Silicon Valley and this company got funded. It's not the same. I wish kids today could feel what you and I had a chance to feel at that moment.
I think there's elements of that, though, even in the contemporary dynamic. My equivalent moment probably for this generation a couple of years ago was when cryptocurrency became a thing.
There you go. That was very similar, very similar.
Right? It was the same kind of thing. All of a sudden, by the way, in a very short period of time, people that really didn't have anything that they meaningfully built, but just because they were around what was going on, either had sudden wealth or were exposed to sudden wealth, which of course then also reversed very quickly. And there's lots of ups and downs along the way. So at an early formative point, I think a lot of powerful lessons were learned. By the way, there was another one. I think there have been multiple moments of this. I think the iPhone coming out in 2007 was another transformative moment. Of course, the internet bubble collapse was a transformative moment. They're markers. So I think Netscape going public was probably a marker. For me, in that time period, I had this 94, 95 extremely active investment in lots of new companies that were just getting started. Some of them took off, some of them didn't. I started a couple of companies, one in 1996 that ended up being a very large public company in 2000, and then crashed and went bankrupt in 2002. Sort of this experience of being in the middle of this thing that the intensity of it ratcheted up every single day. And that was the phenomenal part of it. It wasn't like, oh, this thing happened and now everything's different. It's that literally every day the intensity of what was going on ratcheted up and the potential expanded. all of a sudden new things were happening everywhere, not just in the US, but around the world, against the backdrop, by the way, of absolutely shitty and inadequate infrastructure on the hardware, infrastructure, and software level. The things that were going on, the visions that people were trying to execute, were so far ahead of what the technology could support. And the underlying technology was being built as fast as it could. And some of it was because of these things that people were trying to do with it, made it clear where things needed to go and evolve. And I think that's one of the things that's powerful about this moment in 2020, which is that we now have incredible underpinnings globally around technology that in 1995 was 94, 95 was kind of emergent and born. It exists today. We have incredible structural challenges across the world at many dimensions, which I think the COVID crisis is just amplifying and accelerating. Interestingly, I think we've been in a path of innovation for the last couple of years that has, much of it has been quite interesting, but a lot of it has not really been foundational or transformative in terms of the way that as a society and a species we're interacting with each other. That's the magic moment that you're describing that happened in 1995, when all of a sudden everybody's like, wow, this thing where the whole world gets connected, this way of interacting with computers, and everybody's going to have a computer, like this Bill Gates line of a computer on every desktop, which was mocked for many years. All of a sudden, it's like, I see the future as we're rapidly coming to the future, or it's rapidly coming to meet us. We're in a new place with the dislocation that's happening now, where I think the opportunities that'll be emergent from this, while against the backdrop of incredible stress and profound crisis, will have the same kind of impact on the next 20 years.
Before I let you explain the Boulder thesis, I want to take you to one more historical moment because you lived it. You were there, you saw things. I remember watching 60 Minutes. It was early 2000. I want to say February or March, maybe January. And 60 Minutes was interviewing Michael Saylor of MicroStrategy. I was living in Northern Virginia. He was quite the celebrated guy. I think at the moment in time 60 Minutes interviewed him, he was worth $20 billion on paper, I believe it was. That was the moment. It was like when Saylor came on 60 Minutes and whatever he said, it was something akin to saying, I'm God. And then it was like, bam, it just happened, right?
Well, I know Michael a tiny bit. We're not close. I remember MicroStrategy well because a number of MIT friends ended up going to work there. And it was an example of one of those companies. By the way, it wasn't the only one. I don't know if you know this. It's kind of a fun one. In the last day or two, Michael Saylor is still the CEO of MicroStrategies. They just bought $250 million worth of Bitcoin. They're the first major technology company to use cash and transfer cash to Bitcoin in that kind of significance. I think they've got about $500 million or something in the bank. And his view, the article that I read, the view was we don't need but $50 million of cash to run the business. So we think Bitcoin is a much better store of value than dollars, which is fascinating. Whether it's true or not, who knows? Time will tell.
Bitcoin doesn't have aircraft carriers and nukes to protect its value, though.
Yeah, his argument, and the argument, I'm not going to make the argument, but some people make the argument that Bitcoin also can't issue $6 trillion worth of Bitcoin to support the public markets. It's this very interesting phenomena of the endless debate about what the currency dynamics really are. And let's go back to the starting point, though, for it. Do you know what MicroStrategy's market cap is today, which is 20 years later from that point?
I've not looked at it, no.
$1.3 billion. Still a meaningful company, a meaningful market cap, but so fascinating to think at that moment in time that it was a $20 billion company, and this was going to be the most amazing, incredible transformation ever. And just sort of the cycles of how these things actually work and how value really gets created over a long period of time.
The Boulder thesis. Everything we've been talking about so far, if people are listening closely between the lines, they're listening to a guy, who's got this holistic view about how one goes about being an entrepreneur to create a company. I haven't been taking you through your books exactly, but I'm kind of giving people this feel. They're getting inside your mind philosophically. How does one think about this? How does one start? How did they get into it? Tell me about the Boulder thesis.
So the Boulder thesis is a set of 4 principles that I came out with in 2012 in the first book that I wrote about startup communities, and the book was titled Startup Communities. In 2012, that phrase didn't exist. People refer to these things as, sometimes you'd hear the phrase entrepreneurial ecosystem, but innovation cluster. And a lot of times people would just say the thing that is Silicon Valley. I had moved to Boulder in 1995. Amy and I moved here a couple months before I turned 30. When I sold my first company, I told her we'd be out of Boston by the time I was 30. And 2 months before, she said, I'm moving to Boulder. You can come with me if you want. She had a pretty strong hand to play because we've been married for a couple of years. So we came out here. We didn't know anybody. Knew one guy. He moved away about 6 months later. And from 95 through about 2010, I was very involved in the Boulder startup, what today would be called the Boulder startup community. I wasn't the only one. I was involved with a number of other entrepreneurs who, over a period of time, we rode up the internet bubble. We rode the internet bubble down. By 2003, people started to be emerging from that and starting new companies. 2006, we created and co-founded Techstars. There were four of us, David Cohen, David Brown, me, and a guy named Jared Polis, who is now governor of Colorado. And we started this thing that was just an experiment. We wanted to just have 10 companies that we would fund each year and do it in Boulder and attract some entrepreneurs to Boulder. And so just many of these things that were things that I was doing in the ordinary activity around Boulder and the entrepreneurial activity around Boulder. By 2010, we were starting to emerge from the global financial crisis. If you time travel back to 2008-9, the whole world was going to end. And by 2010, the global economy was still in real distress, but places were starting to be positive again and emergent. Entrepreneurship was not yet trendy and popular, but people were starting to say that the way out of the financial crisis globally would be entrepreneurship and innovation. And there was an article in 2010 that came out that said basically that and pointed to four cities: the Bay Area, which of course is not a city, it's an area, region, a bunch of cities, New York, Boston, and Boulder. Boulder is not like the others. Boulder is 100,000 people. It would fit a couple of buildings in downtown Manhattan. It'd be a little tight, but we'd be able to squeeze everybody in there. Couldn't do social distancing in the age of COVID, but if we all stayed inside all the time, it probably wouldn't matter that much. I started to think in 2010 about what we had done in Boulder that caused Boulder to have a vibrant startup community in 2010. I formed a view that every city that had at least 100,000 people in it could have a vibrant startup community. I had been investing all around the US since I started investing. Even in 1994, when I was living in Boston making angel investments, I was investing in Seattle and San Francisco and LA and New York and Boston and every now and then some other place, Kansas City or Dallas. I just didn't believe the mantra, which was still kind of a mantra even in 2010, that if you were really serious about starting a company, you should just go to the Bay Area. My view was, no, actually, you should be able to create companies that are substantive anywhere in the world. So I started working on trying to understand that. And Boulder was a really convenient place for me to do that because it was big enough to be interesting, but small enough that I could get my mind around everything.
Was that a little bit of that kind of oppositional you from early on? They were like, hold on, you have to go to the Bay Area. And you're like, hold on, no, all this technology allows us to be anywhere. What is this nonsense? I don't have to be in the Bay Area. Was it something like that?
For sure. Thank you, Dr. Freud. I'm sure that there was something in there from the beginning. It's useful to know. A lot of people think that I lived in the Bay Area for some period of time. I never had, although I spent an enormous amount of time in the Bay Area between 1996 and 2005. I probably spent 3 out of 4 weeks in the Bay Area, 1 to 3 days a week in the Bay Area, because the venture firm that I was part of, which was affiliated with SoftBank Venture Capital, ultimately became called Mobius Venture Capital, was based and headquartered in the Bay Area. The natural place for us to move from Boston would be to the Bay Area. I couldn't have told you in 1995 why I didn't want to move to the Bay Area, other than I knew I didn't want to. Today, I know why, which is I don't like big cities. Wherever I would have gone, I would have wanted to be in a place that was like Boulder. I don't mind being nearish of a big city. Denver's 45 minutes away, but the Bay Area and LA are good examples. There is no dynamic like that. It's one big, extended, sprawling collection of things where you can have a different experience. If you live in Marin, if you live in San Rafael, that's a different experience than living in San Francisco or living in Oakland or living in Mountain View. But it's still part of a region. I wasn't into that. It's too many people, too much stuff. Not my thing. Also, when we moved to Boulder, we didn't know if we'd stay in Boulder. If we didn't like Boulder, we'd move somewhere else. When we fell in love with Boulder, part of the reinforcement for me, we fell in love with Boulder 6 months in, was this idea that place mattered a lot. And that instead of going someplace for work, going someplace for opportunity, that I thought people should choose where they wanted to live and then build their life around that. My worldview shifted from going someplace because of a job or going someplace because of an opportunity to, let me figure out where I want to be for whatever reason. And then I should be able to build companies there. And if I can be able to do that, there's nothing special about me being able to do that. There should be a way that anybody that wants to do that anywhere in the world should be able to do that. And that's where the Boulder thesis came from, that sort of line of thinking.
I still remember in the mid-90s when Netscape hit, when the internet hit, and living in Northern Virginia at the time and watching the Dulles corridor, I thought to myself, my gosh, all this office space is going to go away. What's all this office space going to be needed for? People are they're going to go to wherever they want to go. They're not going to drive their car to these buildings. And then in the next 20 years, we built more and more and more. Do you think we ever reach a point in time, and maybe COVID is accelerating this, where we finally have that moment where the technology truly does eliminate the distance, truly does eliminate the need for the space, the big building, so to speak?
I think you're 25 years ahead of your time. Lots of people have different opinions about space, both in the time of COVID and in the future, whatever that means. There is a lot of desire of human beings to be able to say, COVID will end and we will go back to normal. We will go back to February of 2020. I don't believe that. I believe we have accelerated to 2025. As part of the acceleration to 2025, the COVID crisis has shined an incredibly bright light on an immense number of things in our contemporary society that are either broken, unneeded, or ineffective. There are many things, by the way, that were broken, unneeded, or ineffective before COVID, but we had configured our society in such a way where we just sort of continued and meandered through them. Technology, which changes things and disrupts things, and pick your word, has had a very meaningful impact on a lot of stuff. But there are many areas of our society and much of our incumbent ways of behaving that resist it in an extreme way. I'll give a few examples. In January 2020, if I had said to pretty much anyone, in 6 months, the vast majority of office workers around the world will be working from home, not only would people thought I was crazy, they would have said it's impossible. It'll never work. The technology will never hold up. People socially can't do that. Businesses won't be able to figure out how to manage and da-da-da-da-da. Of course, there's plenty of businesses that don't have office workers, or that are businesses where people have to go to a factory or go to a facility of some sort, a hospital. But if you think about the high-rise office buildings in a downtown, most of those buildings have been empty for now a couple of months or 3 or 4 months. The idea that people are going to want to go back to those offices the way they were before, at the same level, the same way, is a fantasy, in my opinion. There will be some people that want to work in an office. There are lots of people that will prefer to work at home. And there are lots of people who say, well, my company is saying I no longer have to live in this overpriced, crowded city that I can barely afford, and I have to commute an hour to my office every day. What I really want to do is I want to live in Carbondale, Colorado, and I want to work hard and be effective at my job. And then I want to ride my mountain bike at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and then come back to my house and have dinner with my family and maybe work another couple hours before I go to bed. And I don't want to have a commute. And that's the life I want to live. And all of a sudden, oh, I can do that? Okay. There's going to be a whole change of configuration, not because the technology enables it, because we've just lived the experience for 3 or 4 months. Another example, sort of in that category, this is the acceleration in a very rapid period of time, is telemedicine. We know, I don't think it's very much up for debate that the healthcare system in the United States is deeply, deeply, deeply flawed. I don't care which side of the political spectrum you're on. I don't care where in the healthcare industry you are. There's just massive, massive pieces of it that are both ineffective and inefficient. We have had technology to do telemedicine for a long time. Telemedicine made 10 years of progress in 4 weeks because during the peak of the COVID crisis in the US at the beginning, April, May, the last place in the world somebody wanted to go if they didn't have COVID was the hospital. However, people still had health issues and they still had to deal with doctors. In addition, during the COVID crisis, it was all hands on deck in lots of communities, New York, for example, Boston, California, Seattle, lots of places where the doctors that were employed, that were active, that were able to be ER doctors or that were able to be repurposed, and the healthcare professionals that could be focused on COVID were. And if you were a doctor who was a heart surgeon or you were a cosmetic surgeon for a cardiologist, unless it was an emergency, you probably didn't have a lot of elective. Cardiologist might be a bad one to use because of elective surgery versus non-elective surgery. But anybody who was doing elective surgeries, I had a number of friends who had hip replacements that were delayed, just no elective surgeries. You had a whole bunch of doctors all of a sudden that were essentially unemployed or underemployed. Telemedicine became a key to unlock some of that in terms of the interactions. I have a neurologist because of some issues. That neurologist had never used telemedicine before 3 months ago. He now uses it all day long, every day for his consults. And when you ask, I don't ever want to come into your office to do a consult. He said, I have to go into an office. We can just schedule a thing and do a telemedicine consult. On and on and on. The simple-minded, last example, simple-minded version of this, I have for a long time, and I'm going to time travel you back to the late 90s again. I have for a long time believed that grocery stores were merely food warehouses. I never understood why grocery stores really existed. We were not investors in Webvan, but one of other SoftBank funds that we weren't involved in was an investor in Webvan. You probably remember Webvan. Spectacular failure. But the idea of Webvan was that all these gigantic facilities around the country were food warehouses, and the food got ordered online and got delivered to your house. Voila, in 2020, in a very short period of time, by the way, that technology is not new, many people changed their behavior so that they might order their food online and drive their car to the grocery store, and a bag was stuck in the back of their car because they didn't want to go in the grocery store and they didn't want to expose themselves. And then lots of other people are having food delivered to their homes. There's lots of social inequity in that, in how that's distributed between who can afford to do that and who does that and where that's available. But the idea of the structural change is dramatic. We're going to see it in higher ed. We're going to see it in K through 12. We're already seeing it with media. Like, why would anybody go to a movie theater ever again?
But people want to. In the back of their mind, they still want to maybe go to the concert. They still want to go to the theater. The question is health issues, of course.
Let me separate those. I think people will absolutely want to do live concerts. People will absolutely want to do live sports. Those are social activities that are foundational. Do you really want to go to a movie theater and pay a lot of money for a ticket and eat very overpriced popcorn and sit next to somebody who's coughing? Now that you can watch that same movie at home on your TV, on your couch, even if you have to pay the same amount of money, the popcorn's a lot cheaper. You don't have to wait for the movie to start. You can start it when you're ready. If you get interrupted, you can pause it. There's some other shifts. Of course, there's going to be plenty of parts of our society.
I'm defending movie theaters and I don't go.
All right, fine. That's fine. It's interesting. Like, you think about live sports, it is hard to imagine a world where live sports is not a fundamental part of the human experience for lots of reasons, including that live sports in some ways is a proxy for war or for battle or for competition. If you think about live sports, though, from the perspective of the historical experience, and think about how technology has been creeping into the historical experience, in this moment, the only way to have live sports and engage with it is with technology. I would expect over the next 12 months, as live sports tries to engage and starts up and shuts down and starts up and shuts down, and there's still going to be a lot of interesting things in technology that exist that change our behavior and our interaction with live sports in a way that probably is long-term transformative. Could be wrong. It's a hypothesis, not a statement.
Let me keep you at the sports for a moment. You mentioned early on, you said, okay, you're doing really well in the math SATs, but you're still athletic. And I know you're a marathon guy. I've never done a marathon. I'm more of a yoga guy these days. Tell me, though, as you mentioned healthcare, we all know the problems of healthcare in America. I happen to be in the least obese country in the world right now. Quite skinny, quite a different experience. But you, as a guy who has the discipline to go crank out the marathons, I mean, I'm sure there's been some pitfalls and pratfalls and aches and pains and all that kind of stuff, but still, there's a discipline. And I imagine that marathon mentality has kept you in better shape than most Americans, where there's a significant number of Americans, I don't know if it's over 50%, are considered obese. So ultimately, I wonder, in COVID, I think I've lost 20 pounds coming out of our first lockdown. How much do you think that we can ever get to a point to where healthcare in America is not just something where we think there's a guy behind the curtain, a government official, et cetera, who can help us, where we might look in the mirror and get a little bit of the Brad marathon mentality?
God, my dad would love you. My dad's a doctor who has been retired for 20 years, and he started writing a blog about 10 years ago. His blog is stanfeld.com, and he rants and raves about the healthcare system lots of times, very correctly, sometimes from my perspective, over the top. But his fundamental thesis is that the problem with healthcare in America is that the patients don't take responsibility for their healthcare. And the system is structured in such a way that inhibits the doctor-patient relationship. The idea that if we actually, as individuals, focused more on our personal responsibility, and there was a way to eliminate a lot of the incumbent barriers for that across the entirety of society, because you have a very, very broad in our country, very broad demographics around all kinds of things, not just gender and race, but socioeconomic background, education background, age, and all of those things, education level, all of those things play into how you deal with your own health. And by the way, let's take it from physical health to mental health, which is a thing I've talked a lot about. In our country still, in the US, we have this incredible stigma around things like mental health, having mental health issues, and our healthcare system is very inadequate in the context of supporting and helping people across mental health issues. If you've got resources and you've got financial resources, you can do better than others. But if you don't have financial resources and you don't have time and you don't have the ability to engage a certain way, and you don't even have a network that allows you to engage a certain way with a certain type of healthcare, or you have cultural norms that have spread through your community that keep you away from certain things because of stigma or because of something else. These are all the barriers that exist, some of which are structural because of the way things work in our country, some of which are incumbency dynamics, and some of which, by the way, are just historical evolution year after year after year of certain types of structures that, again, COVID is causing many of them to just collapse.
I hope people take into account, as we're having this conversation, this is about startup communities. Your 2 books out right now, right? People might say, well, gosh, this conversation, you guys are all over the map. You're talking about so many different things. Not really, because I think it's all about the supporting, it's the sharing. And then you get inside the support and the sharing and you learn the technique, you learn the strategy, you learn the mindset. But there has to be a conversation. It's not just all, here's the quote book, whoever's book, and like, here's the 10 things you do. It's this holistic philosophical conversation, I think, has to be a part of it. And then whatever idea one has, whatever venture they want to start, they go do it. But then they've got these conversations. They've got this ability to have the support, the sharing. Look, it's the reason I love doing this podcast. I get a chance to talk to a guy like you that'll keep me energized for the whole damn day. That is the thing I think a lot of us are missing these days.
Thank you. It's very energizing for me too. The goal of writing a book, people have different goals. For me, the goal of writing a book is to work out some thoughts. I work thoughts out by writing. I practice what's worked out by talking. There's multiple ways of sort of working through ideas. And for me, it's experiencing something, spending a lot of time trying to write it down. And then when I've written it down, talking about it, and then being challenged and learning and stretching it from there. In the context of a thing that is been a big part of my professional experience, which is this idea of building startup communities, which is linked to the notion that entrepreneurship should be something that can be done anywhere in the world, which is linked back to an idea and a concept that I had when I was in school, which is the democratization of innovation. My doctoral advisor in school, a guy named Eric von Hippel, was very focused on this notion of democratizing innovation. Innovation was not the bastion of the GE corporate lab or the IBM corporate lab. He made a very important statement in the late 1970s that was the foundation of much of his research for many years, which is that users drive innovation. If you extend that conceptually and include, for example, the idea of where innovation occurs, well, the user shouldn't have to go to a place or be in a structure to be able to create that innovation, at least from that premise. And interestingly, I think in 2020, we've proved out a couple of things. One is this notion of the democratization of entrepreneurship and innovation. It's a global phenomenon. Next, that's part of that again links back to everything we've been talking about, is that we use in the book, The Startup Community, the idea of complexity theory and the idea of a complex system to describe how to evolve a startup community. And the complex system idea is essential to everything we've been talking about. If you go back to any of the topics and pull on the thread, we're not talking about deterministic systems that can have a solution. You don't say on day X, the problem is solved. The puzzle is finished and all the pieces are there. The coffee is made and my cup of coffee is finished because I put it through the machine and now I have my cup of coffee. We're talking about these systems that continually change and evolve, and what happens affects the next things that happen, that affects the next things that happen, and on and on and on and on and on. I think that's what's so fascinating about the moment we find ourselves in, which is that people who are entrepreneurial and live in a world of entrepreneurship, whether or not they're founders, but are comfortable with entrepreneurial thinking, I think are much better suited for the next wave of what happens to us as a species than people that aren't. That isn't to say that there's a good and there's a bad. It's to say that there's a lot of benefit to everyone from trying to understand a little bit better how to be an entrepreneurial thinker, not necessarily be an entrepreneur, but to think in ways that don't have deterministic outcomes, that don't have a clear path to an answer.
You mentioned that complex adaptive system. And I think of the trading books that I've written, these kind of mechanical quant strategies. And it's all about the inability to predict tomorrow. It's all about David Ricardo, let your winners run, cut your losers short, and do it over a diversified portfolio, knowing from the start that you have no earthly idea which one's going to be the winner. If you've got this complex adaptive system, those kinds of strategies where you kind of have to have some diversification in your thinking, that's the way to navigate. And that's Entrepreneur 101.
Yep. Very, very true.
Hey, great stuff, Brad. 2 books. Let's see if I get all these correct. The Startup Community Way, Evolving an Entrepreneurial Ecosystem, and Startup Communities, Building an Entrepreneurial Ecosystem in Your City. Great stuff. Hey, where's the best place people can find you? Where do you want to direct them to?
I'm easy to find. Twitter is @bfeld. Website is feld.com. And email is extraordinarily easy to guess because it's just my first name @feld.com.
Same. First name @covel.com.
Hard to hide from the email if somebody wants to email me. My only request is if somebody listening emails me, give me a hint where you're coming from and where you heard me.
Yeah, and also I think too, if you're going to inundate, be kind. I mean, try and check out some stuff Brad's done first. Don't just say something silly. Try to be smart. You'll get a better response if it's smart. Hey, great stuff. I appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Let me give you a little factoid that you, because I wasn't, maybe you were, but I don't think so. You were not aware that in 1965, the United States government helped to kill 1 million people inside Indonesia. I mean, yes, they were in Vietnam at the time. Yes, they were in Cambodia. They were in Laos. But our government, the CIA, through the cloak of darkness, assisted, led, however you want to call it, to the killing of 1 million people inside Indonesia. Now, look, the CIA has surely done some good things, but post-World War II, it did a lot of bad things. My guest today, Vincent Bevins, he digs deep. His book, The Jakarta Method, Washington's anti-communist crusade, and the mass murder program that shaped our world. This might be one of those conversations where you say to yourself, I don't want to know. I don't care. It's not interesting to me. And you know what I would say? Fuck you. It should be interesting to you. If you're a human being, if you're alive, if you have a pulse, you want to know how things work, how things have worked, for good and bad. If you're not curious, you're dead. You're pant waste. And I think we should all be so fortunate to have curious people on this planet like Vincent. People that go deep to find stories that, let's face it, a lot of people don't want found. Every day that I do this podcast, every new episode, I say to myself how fortunate that I am that I get to experience people that have dedicated their lives to a niche, a subject, a story, to figure something out. And it keeps me fresh. It keeps me alive. And if you listen to me on a regular basis, I'm sure as hell thinking it does the same thing for you. I promise you, this is one damn interesting story, damn sad story. But you should know it. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my conversation with Vincent Bevins and discuss the Jakarta method. Here's where I want to get rolling with you. Some quick background on me. So I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. I've had enough political experience, ran for political office when I was 21. Nothing big, lost, but a great experience growing up in that area. I mean, in the sense that I wish I could forget it all, in the sense once you know what's going on, it's not so fun. And I would say today, if I'm reaching for what I would consider a voice, I'm going to add you to the list, but if I'm reaching for a group of voices that I think are going to give me something straight, even if they come from different partisan polls, I was jotting down names. There's 4 guys I can think of right off the bat. Glenn Greenwald, which is where I first saw you, Matt Taibbi, Tucker Carlson, and Jonathan Turley, the professor. Those 4 guys, to me, seem like they speak truth to power, even if they come from different partisan edges. The rest of the world out there is really tough stuff. Now, I think you clearly are used to speaking truth to power, huh?
I mean, I've spent all of my career in mainstream foreign journalism. All of my journalistic instincts and skills were honed within that world. But this is a story that is just by its very nature clashes with existing understandings of the world and the nature of politics in the globalized 21st century. To tell this story responsibly, to be a serious or even quote-unquote objective journalist, you have to sort of inevitably be controversial on this topic just because the truth of what really happened is so at odds with perceived understandings.
Let me get you to start somewhere you might not expect. I'd like to start in modern day because I think a lot of people have had a chance for the last 4 years to hear all kinds of news. And clearly America is a 50-50 place. There's partisan polls. The reality from my perspective is people can argue their partisan poll, but the reality is they don't control a damn thing. And there's this, whatever one wants to call it, the deep state, whatnot. There's these forces that have things moving along behind the scenes that people really don't get a chance to vote on. And I think that's going to come out in some of your experience as well, too. But let's speak to, I would like for you to open up with just a notion of the CIA today, because I think for most people in the last 4 years, they've heard the phrase, they've heard it, the CIA a lot. The whole Trump thing in Russia, this whole thing has been out there. And I'll have to say, I do kind of share a perspective that Taibbi and Greenwald come at on this topic, that sense that they're kind of like, hey, look, I'm not a huge fan of Trump. That's what they would say. I'm not a huge fan of Trump, but what the hell have we been doing for the last 4 years? With that backdrop, give me some feeling from your perspective about what has been happening in the modern American perspective, the modern American understanding of the CIA in the last 4 years. It seems like we've gone off the rails.
I think that one thing that I perhaps share with Taibbi and Greenwald on a very basic level is we've all spent a lot of time outside the United States. And I think if you look at the United States from 2016 to 2020, if you take a very broad perspective and you're not deep in it, I think it looks kind of like a country in ideological crisis. And I think to a significant extent that you had sort of a meltdown when Trump was elected. And I certainly understand why the liberal Democrat leading side of U.S. politics had such a hard time dealing with it. But I think as a result of that very deep ideological crisis, and I might go as far to say that contemporary liberalism is in crisis, not in just the United States, but globally, you saw this kind of very strange realignment where the half of U.S. politics that had previously always hated neoconservatives, always considered the CIA a force for evil in the world, made an alliance with some of those figures in the service of anti-Trumpism. And whether or not that's tactically in their interests, I don't know. I'm not one of those partisans. But what I can say is that as I dove into the history of what the CIA really was since the beginning, the things that it's done in the decades that we know about, and meeting all the people that suffered as a result of those activities, it's very strange for me to see the CIA or the U.S. intelligence community held up as some kind of an important ally for anything, especially for the side of the aisle in American politics that likes to consider itself concerned with human rights and the equalities of peoples and liberalism more generally. So while I don't exactly have the expertise on the modern CIA that I just halfway acquired, I'm still not an expert on the 50s and 60s and 70s. It's been strange to see the contortions happening in U.S. politics in the Trump era.
Yeah, because I think that what's happening right now, you're not having access to any kind of inside information right now or anything like that, but it sure seems like when you look at some of the behavior in the last handful of years, and then we start to look at behavior in the 50s, 60s, 70s, et cetera, maybe that's the through line, is that this has always been kind of an operation that is not really beholden to anybody. I mean, it's beholden to a few people that are making decisions, but it really strikes you like, who the hell is pulling the marionette strings?
Yeah, this is something I want to write about in the future, but I could flesh it out here, that there's kind of a binary when it comes to understanding U.S. intelligence and CIA coups and plots and their role in world history. And on one hand, there's the side that says, oh, they control everything. They're all powerful. They're always pulling the strings. There's the other side that says, oh, no, they mess up all the time. They're totally irresponsible. They're laughably incompetent, and they just screw up the whole world. And I think that both of those things are wrong because both of those things can be true at the same time. And the reason they can be true at the same time is that when you are the covert operations apparatus for the most powerful country on earth, nothing was going to get you in trouble. There's no referee. You can try to do a coup in Guatemala in 1954 and fail, and then try again and fail, and then try in the third time, and then it works. It's definitely wrong that the CIA is pulling strings everywhere and always getting what they want. But it is true that when you have absolute impunity, and I mean, despite all of the horrible crimes we found out about in 1975 with the Church Committee, nobody got in trouble. At no point in the history of U.S. foreign operations would anybody come to the conclusion that they should be careful. There's no reason for anybody to think that way. Whatever changes may have happened in the U.S. foreign policy apparatus over the last 50, 60 years, no hammer ever comes down on these characters. And often, you know, in the case of the people who very loudly led us to a catastrophic war in Iraq, they could all come back 10, 15 years later as in the guise of anti-Trump Republicans or whatever. And until now, there has been no punishment for anybody assisting or carrying out atrocities on behalf of the U.S. government. Yeah.
When I start to go through your world, your work, and I look at the last 4 years of messaging and whether or not there's some truth to it, there doesn't seem to be a lot, if there is any truth to it. But the notion of Trump, Putin, Soviets, Russia, communism, etc., and then I trace it back decades and decades and decades back in your work, and it's like, wow, this has been going on for a long time. This is not a new thing to tar and feather anyone with, is it?
Oh, no. In the wake of the election of Donald Trump, I absolutely don't think that Vladimir Putin is blameless or that one should deny the seriousness of what he might have done in 2016. But at the same time, I do believe that a lot of the reaction may have been just flexing a muscle that already existed. Just there was that muscle memory to, rather than look at other things that may have caused an election to happen, the easy thing to do is to go back to that thing we know how to do, which was you blame the Russians and you put everything on a foreign enemy. And it was right there.
Both sides have done this for decades. It's not just one side.
Oh, no, absolutely. And it just happened to be the case that in 2018 that the liberals were sort of reeling, I think, from a very unexpected and very difficult loss. It goes back and forth. I mean, again, I don't think China is blameless when it comes to their early handling of the coronavirus, but I think it's going to be very easy to just blame everything on a bad foreign power. As you say, this muscle we've developed over decades, if not centuries, of American history, I think it gets flexed too quickly sometimes to throw everything on the big bad foreign enemy with a secret international plot. Because the reality is we're the most powerful country. We've been the most powerful country for a very long time. If we want to have a full explanation of what's going wrong, we're usually the first place we should look.
Okay, so if I take it back in time, so we get through World War II, I think most people, regardless of their partisan stripe across the planet, would say the Americans did pretty good. Okay, there's all kinds of things that people would have liked to have done better. Dropping nukes if we didn't have to do that. Sure, there's all kinds of things. But I think most people would say a real wave of perhaps good things started to unfold, or at least the notion of what happened to stop the war, the Americans got credit for. We got credit for. I'm an American. And a lot of that was about, hey, look, let's stop Stalin. Let's stop the Soviets. Let's win the Cold War, etc. Look, I'm 51. So in 1984, 85, I mean, it was still in the middle of the Cold War. I thought they'd send me somewhere. So what was the pivot? What was the first moment where we really pivoted post-World War II, where we started to go down this path that you really open up in your world, your work? The bad path.
The short answer, I think, is around 1953. The long answer is that I agree with you that I put it this way in the book, that the United States is a country with some very dark foundational elements. There was the genocide of native peoples, there was slavery, but there was also this revolutionary tradition, this yet unrealized ideal of full citizenship for everyone. And I think in World War II, we were the good guys. We were not the only good guys, but the positive side of our nature really came to the fore, and we rightfully enjoyed global prestige as a result of the heroic efforts of lots of young Americans fighting fascism. Now, a lot of those same guys that fought in World War II got hired by the new covert operations force of the United States, which was called the CIA. And we didn't have one before this. The British did because they'd been running an empire for a very long time. The Russians did because they had inherited some spycraft expertise from the Russian Empire, and then also the early years of the Soviet Union, they felt that they were attacked from all sides, which was basically true. The United States did not have this until the CIA was founded in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. And the guys that were picked for this tended to be liberal, cosmopolitan, blue blood elite, so Yale guys that considered themselves very globally minded and forward thinking. And they were given a lot of money, and they were given the task of fighting communism. The thing is that when they tried to take on the actual Soviet bloc, they failed. In the early years of the CIA, they were parachuting people into Soviet-controlled areas of Eastern Europe. They were trying to run covert operations in Korea. All of this failed. And the reason it failed is because the actual secret police of the Soviet Union and its new allies or countries under its dominion were good enough to catch them. But still, you have these guys that want to get something done. They have this remit. They have all this money. They come from the kind of culture where they're supposed to be performing. They want to show that they're doing a good job. And so they turn to the third world.
Why don't you define the first, second, and third world from your perspective?
Absolutely. I think the word third world has become sort of pejorative in the English language now because people used it in such a horrible way for a very long time. But I find that that division is pretty useful, especially when you're talking about 1945. Because in the original iteration of third world, it was an entirely positive, optimistic, hopeful project. So the first world at the end of World War II was the rich countries that had engaged in imperialism or colonialism of some kind. So Western Europe, United States, Japan. The second world was the Soviet Union and the countries that it had just occupied in World War II. Russia itself, all of the Central Asian Soviet republics, and then up to the Iron Curtain, as it were. And the third world is the rest of humanity, and that is the vast majority of the world's peoples. And the vast majority of the world's peoples had lived under European colonialism for decades, if not hundreds of years, and they had really suffered from this. This was essentially slavery. This is the kind of horrible oppression that the American revolutionary tradition recognizes as something that is unjust and needs to be undone. So when the third world came together in the first years after World War II, they had this project that finally we're going to take our place on the world stage. We finally have our freedom, so we're going to stand up alongside the white people that used to control us and alongside the communists that we don't want to be like them. We also don't really hate them, and we want to take our place alongside those other major powers. And when the CIA, after failing in Eastern Europe, turns to the third world, even sympathetic historians of the agency recognize that they didn't really understand what the third world was. These were all guys that had studied in prep schools in the Eastern Corridor that were modeled on English prep schools. They all fancied themselves great European intellectuals, but they had very little idea of what an Iranian or a Guatemalan or a Congolese
or Vietnamese
is a very good example. I mean, you're in Vietnam, and one of the more tragically paradoxical moments of this history is that even Ho Chi Minh, who was definitely a communist and was definitely hard-nosed about his attitudes towards the West, in 1945, when he declared independence from France, he quoted the Declaration of Independence of the United States as in a very obvious attempt to associate the third world independence movements with the American revolutionary tradition, because he didn't want to go to war with the most powerful country on earth, and he thought that this could work out. Of course, instead of telling Ho Chi Minh, okay, well, we can be sort of friends with you as long as you be the best kind of leader you can be, we helped the French try to reconquer Vietnam. In the first quote-unquote success of this new CIA is in Iran in 1953. Even though the war on communism was used to a large extent to justify the intervention that overthrew Iran's democracy, it was very tied up with old European imperial interests. So it was really the British that were pressing the US to get involved. The British were really worried about their oil interests in Iran. The British had controlled this strip of Asia for a very long time, and they got the CIA to organize, press for, and successfully carry out a coup that installed the Shah for a very long time. And this was seen, finally, for the CIA and for President Eisenhower as a huge success. Finally, this thing we've created that was failing everywhere, it works. We've, number one, stopped communism, quote unquote, even though the leader was not communist at all. And two, we've scored a big victory for the corporate interests, which are so important to US strategy around the world. And after that, you start to see the attempt to reproduce this quote unquote success in other parts of the third world. I think that's the turning point. I kind of try to draw this sort of dramatically in the book that after World War II, there's kind of a fork in the road. And on the one hand, are we going to use this new status as the most powerful nation in history to affirm the revolutionary ideals upon which the country was founded? Or are we going to occupy the same kind of space that the European imperialists occupied? And I think in 1953, we took a hard turn towards the latter option.
There's an issue here, a base level issue that I still see with friends of mine today, especially conservative friends. Now, look, obviously, you know where I'm calling you from, and you can probably guess that I've, in a handful of years, have figured out a little bit about history that I might not have known before. So again, as you say about Taibbi and Greenwald and yourself, when you spend a little time outside the States, you get a different perspective. I think the thing that a lot of people in the States still have no clue about when they start to talk about even mainland China or other communist countries, there's only a handful left around the world, is that these countries, because of colonialism, had shit except for people. They had massive populations. And in many ways, at least from my perspective, and you might go a lot more deeper than this than me, this was a rallying cry. Communism was a rallying cry to say, hey, see all those white guys over there, those French guys, those British guys? If we group together, we can beat them because we have people power. They might have everything else, but they can't defeat our populations. And that's essentially what happened, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, there's a scene in the book that I outline where John F. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy, because they want to be foreign policy experts, because they have the money to do so, they're traveling all around the world. And Nehru, the leader of India at the time, he says this to Bobby Kennedy. He says, and we have Bobby Kennedy, because he furiously jots this down. He says, look, communism is giving people something to fight for. And he's not a communist. He's just trying to explain the boneheadedness of the American approach to the third world at the time. He tells Bobby Kennedy, look, communism is giving people something to fight for. All you're offering them is the status quo. And it was not really clear. It was clear to some very cynical actors in the U.S. foreign policy establishment, which we can talk about. But it was not very clear to a lot of people in the United States just how terrible that status quo was. So Indonesia, which is now the fourth largest country in the world by population, when they came out of centuries of Dutch rule, only 5% of the Indonesian population could read and write. And this was on purpose. Indonesia was treated as a giant export
slave colony.
Yeah, it was a giant extraction center for natural resources. When I sat down with a lot of elderly people from this part of Asia or Latin America, when they came out of World War II in 1946, 47, they knew that Europe was racist and had enslaved them for hundreds of years. They didn't know exactly what America was going to do as a new leader of the world, but they knew that also America was racist and that they were friends with the Europeans. So when the United States starts helping the French to recolonize Vietnam, when they see the overthrow of democracy in Iran and Guatemala, and they're paying very close attention. This was not huge news in the United States, but this was huge news in the third world. They came to the conclusion, it's like, okay, well, then the United States is like the old white people, and they're imperialists. And even though the Soviet Union may not be the best place in the world to live, they haven't done anything to me. Stalin's crimes don't even come out until the 50s. But even when they do, if you're Indonesian and you're looking out at the world, a lot of them thought, look, the United States is doing what the Europeans did. The United States is clearly a racist place. The Soviet Union did not do anything to me. And so a small amount of people in the third world became dedicated allies of the Soviet Union. There were dedicated Marxist-Leninist parties. But a really large contingent wanted to be non-aligned, which was to say, we're not joining Washington's military alliance. We're not helping out as you try to reconquer Vietnam with the French, but we're also not aligning with the Soviet Union. So what we want is we want our good relations with both, because frankly, we desperately need aid from both countries. We're, like you said, we have nothing. We need advisors. We need loans. We can't afford to fight a Cold War. We need to be friends with everyone. We just don't have that luxury. And under Truman, there was a brief period in which it was considered tolerable for nations in the third world to be neutral. Under Eisenhower, and after the quote-unquote success of Iran, neutrality was seen as being the enemy. After 1953, if you were not explicitly in an alliance with the United States, then you were, if not on the chopping block for intervention, an intervention against you could be justified if it became necessary. This is what happens throughout the 50s and 60s. And again, although in the US we kind of put this in a part of our memory where like that doesn't count, that was an abuse, that was people running wild, that's not what we really stand for. If you were in Morocco or Chile or South Africa in 1955 and you were looking at this, you came to the conclusion that is what the United States is. That's what they're going to do. So we need to either come together and form some kind of alliance or to get into a defensive position in preparation for some kind of an intervention here. This is a maddening bit of cognitive dissonance among U.S. policymakers in the 50s and 60s, is that even while all these coups are happening and even while they're very obviously trying to help France reconquer a colony in the second half of the 20th century, they don't understand why people around the world don't trust them or don't want to be in an alliance. They're like, well, these people must be crazy. They must be irresponsible. And to a large extent, racism was involved. And especially if these peoples were African or Asian, they'd be like, oh, these people are immature. They're children. They don't understand. People understood what it meant that the United States was toppling these regimes.
I've been listening to how you lay this out, and I'm trying to find, because I'm sure some other people listening perhaps will be looking for the same thing. I'm looking for your partisan pole, your angle. I'm sure you've got one, but in everything you're describing to me, this is just straightforward. I don't know what the argument could be. I mean, this is history. This is what happened, I hope people, when they hear what you're saying, they don't get triggered because, I mean, let's face it, I really think about at least 50% of America, if they hear the word communism, they start shaking. In 2020, they start shaking. It's nuts. Let me bring you up to 1965. I've been to Bali briefly. It's a little bit different. It's a Hindu island. But take me to 1965. Take me to getting into the Jakarta method, because this is such an interesting phrase, the Jakarta method. But what happened in Indonesia in the middle of the Vietnam War, as they might call it, the American War, not as they might, as they do call it the American War. But take me to 1965 Indonesia.
This picture that I've drawn of countries in the third world wanting to stay out of Washington's way, but also not trusting them, this non-aligned movement, this movement of the neutral third world, the most prominent leader of this movement was Sukarno, who was the founding father of Indonesia. He was a man that was very visionary in terms of bringing together the thousands of islands and dozens of ethnicities and many religions and hundreds of languages into one sort of national ideology. And he was the George Washington of Indonesia. In 1955, as he starts to organize these first major conferences of African and Asian peoples, and as the Communist Party in Indonesia starts to do better and better in his young democracy, the CIA tries to turn its tools on him. So in 1955, they fund a right-wing conservative party, a Muslim party, in the attempt to stop the Communist Party from winning elections. It doesn't work. The communists still do better and better.
Before you get rolling, lay out for people your research angle here, because as you say this, some people are going to immediately say, well, how the hell does he know this is a story he's telling? You've been working with a lot of data and a lot of documents going back a long time, and we're talking about U.S. government documents.
Right. I spent 3 years working on this myself. What the book really does is it combines probably 5 or 6 centuries of academic research, declassified documents coming out of Washington, and then me doing 125 to 150 interviews in 12 countries in 4 languages to fill in the human side of this. The picture that I'm painting right now about U.S., the CIA funding Masyumi, the conservative Muslim party, that's declassified information. What Richard Nixon said as vice president at the time is also declassified. He said, quote, "A democratic government is probably not the best kind for Indonesia because, quote, the communists could probably not be beaten in election campaigns because they were so well organized." They realized in the middle of the 50s, okay, the communists are doing too well. And again, they're not running the country. They're just winning a sizable chunk in parliament. And then in 1958, the CIA invades the country. In 1958, there is a actual bombing campaign of Indonesia, and an American pilot is caught because he crash lands, survives, and they find his identifying papers on him. And this is further proof to the skeptical voices in Indonesia that the United States is trying to break our country to pieces, which is exactly what was happening. But at that point, they got caught. This was kind of a Bay of Pigs moment in Asia. They really got caught with their pants down. There was nothing they could say or do to deny this. I mean, the guy was on TV being paraded by the Indonesian left. And so they switched tactics, especially with the arrival of John F. Kennedy. But from 1958 to 1964, they kind of are friendly with Sukarno, this founding father, while training and arming the U.S. military in Kansas. And thousands of officers come to Kansas to get training. And in my book, one of the main characters, and the book is told through the personal narratives of people whose lives crisscrossed with this bigger story. And one of the guys that I got to know quite well was in Kansas at the time and hanging out in bars and going out on the town with these Indonesian officers that were getting trained by the United States. But the idea was to get them to be pro-American and anti-communist, and to a large extent that worked. Now, in the 60s, 2 things happen which change Washington's posture again. 2 things happen which cause the U.S. foreign policy establishment to once again treat Indonesia as a target. The first is that John F. Kennedy is killed. And when John F. Kennedy is killed, the very tenuous alliance between Washington and Indonesia falls apart. Lyndon Johnson doesn't want to spend political capital maintaining this alliance. And 2, Sukarno picks a fight with Great Britain in Malaysia over the creation of a new post-colonial state that he believes that lines are being intentionally drawn in the map to weaken him, which is basically true. But he ends up picking a fight with Great Britain, and the United States entirely changes its orientation towards Indonesia. And they switch out the ambassador. They bring in a new ambassador who is widely understood to be somebody that's there to carry out regime change. And we still don't know exactly what it is that the CIA and MI6 did in 1964 and 1965. So these files are declassified, even though I tried to get access, didn't work. But we know what they wanted to happen was a clash between the US-backed right-wing military and the unarmed Communist Party, because they knew in any such clash, the army would win, because the Indonesian Communist Party, and this is very different from what people in the US tend to think about when they hear communists these days, but the Indonesian Communist Party was a very old school communist party in the sense that they believed you had to build capitalism first, and then you would build socialism. So their short-term and medium-term goal was just to support President Sukarno, support anti-colonial struggles, and then 50 years later, 40 years later, as they put it, make a transition to socialism. MI6 and CIA knew that if a clash happened between the army and the Communist Party would have no chance. In a very mysterious manner, in a manner we still do not understand, on September 30th, 1965, this clash erupts. There is some kind of a plot to arrest generals that other military officers claim are going to organize a right-wing coup. For reasons we don't understand, 6 of these generals are killed. But what we do know is that this clash has been created. The desired conflict between the Indonesian right and the Indonesian left can now take place. And so immediately, General Suharto, who is a right-wing general in the Indonesian military, seizes control of the country, shuts down all media that he does not control, and spreads an intentional lie to say that it was actually the Indonesian Communist Party that was behind this uprising, that they actually took these 6 generals, performed a horrible, sexual, satanic, murderous dance upon them in which women associated with the Communist Party castrated these men as part of some wicked communist witchcraft. And this becomes the narrative that is spread throughout the country. He controls all media. It's entirely false. We know that no members of the Indonesian women's movement were involved in this. But this story is sort of the perfect way to whip up hatred of the Communist Party in a country where 2 weeks previously, 25 or 30% of the country was communist voter. From the very beginning, we now know from declassified files and in the book, and you can read exactly what the embassy is saying to Washington, and you can see exactly the way that the U.S. government is interacting with the generals. From the very beginning, the U.S. government sees it as its role to help spread this propaganda story, which they do, to help Suharto establish power, which they do, to help Suharto crush the communists, which they do, and to encourage the destruction of the Communist Party, which they do. We don't know whose idea it was to start killing people. We don't know if this was something that had been planned for a long time or if it was something that arose spontaneously from circumstances. We don't know if Suharto came up with it on his own or if it had been planned in concert with some foreign actors for a long time. But we know that soon after the mass arrests start, mass killings start. And the U.S. government gets reports of the mass killings, and they continue to encourage the destruction of the Communist Party, knowing fully well that that means the mass killings that are taking place. In one case, we know because someone came forward and just told the Washington Post. He said that he handed lists over to the Indonesian generals, communists, so that they could cross their names off in the most horrible fashion you can imagine. And so I met a lot of the people that were swept up in this violence, people that had been either working at a union and so therefore were arrested, or wanted to be a teacher, so were in a association somehow linked with the Communist Party, or people that were just fully in the Communist Party. And across the board, these people, when they went into prison, they thought that they would be fine. They thought that they were just going to be interviewed. They were going to explain what was going on. It was just kind of a precautionary measure. Then they would be released. But to their horror, they found that when they were in jail, some people would be taken away, maybe in the middle of the night. Maybe they would disappear at some point. They would just never come back. And this tactic of overseeing the execution of innocent people took the lives of 500,000 to 1 million, maybe more people. And it allowed the Indonesian general Suharto to take power. This was not sort of vengeful violence. This was not retroactive punishment after he took power. He would not have been able to become the dictator if he had not crushed and terrified the left of the country because it was 30% of the country. So with 1 million people dead, another million people in concentration camps, everybody else that had been sympathetic to Sukarno, sympathetic to the Communist Party, and these two entities were not the same, but Sukarno was to the left of the army for sure. All these people shut their mouths, and they shut their mouths until this day. It's still very hard to get elderly Indonesians to talk about what they were doing in the 60s or what their political beliefs were, because it became very clear in 1965, 66, if you admit that you are sympathetic with the largest party at the time, and again, we know from declassified files that even CIA and MI6 recognized they would win elections if they had continued to take place after 1958, they would have won. Everybody shut their mouth.
If I go back in time in the memory banks, I can remember watching Oliver Stone's JFK at whatever point in time that came out. I remember thinking, okay, this is batshit crazy. This is just off the hook. You know, conspiracy theories, all kinds of stuff. I roll forward. I gain a few more years in life. I find out a few more things that have happened in this part of the world. And you start to scratch your head, because to me, it really does seem like that when JFK was killed, and you just laid out one example, I think another example of LBJ's efforts can be seen in what happened in Vietnam. I mean, the massive buildup had not taken place under JFK. But when he was gone, it was like the decks were cleared. I mean, was Johnson an empty vessel, or was he actively engaged with all of this stuff around this part of the world?
Johnson was less willing to stand up to the foreign policy, quote-unquote, experts around him. Johnson, as you can imagine, comes into office in a very difficult position. The president's been killed. Nobody knows why or how, and I think that we still don't know why or how technically. And Kennedy had always fancied himself a foreign policy expert. You know, this was his deal at Harvard. He had written a book about this. Johnson was not a foreign policy expert. So to a large extent, when...
He was a good old boy political animal from Texas.
Yes, he was very good at the Senate. He was very good at running D.C. He didn't really understand the rest of the world, and even sympathetic biographers say that he kind of just thought the rest of the world was like America. He just didn't really get it. But also, he didn't want to spend political capital standing up to the foreign policy advisors around him. So to a large extent, he just kind of did what they said he should do. And in the case of Indonesia, I think the Indonesia tragedy is one of the most important and most underappreciated consequences of Kennedy's death, because Howard Jones, the ambassador who had been in Indonesia, very energetically trying to maintain good relations between the two countries, he in his memoirs says that JFK would not have abandoned this stance. And Johnson did, and he kind of doesn't, he's very diplomatic. He doesn't really blame Johnson. He says it's difficult for him to keep this going in Washington, but basically it's a fight that Johnson doesn't want to pick. Johnson lets the people around him in political establishment in Washington, D.C. tell him that he needs to stop putting up with this communist troublemaker in Indonesia.
One of the most interesting conversations I've had with a historian that came on this show, he was talking about his work and research into digging into the MacArthur-JFK relationship. And MacArthur told JFK, don't get into a land war in Asia. And I asked this guy, and I think this author came from a more conservative perspective, but I said, look, do you think that there's any chance that JFK would have done in Vietnam what LBJ said? And he's like, I just can't see it. He goes, I can't see JFK would have done that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, JFK certainly didn't have his hands clean in the second half of the 50s.
Not as clean, but comparatively to what happened.
That's what I was going to say, is that there was sort of the cynical way to be sort of neo-colonial or imperialist, and there's the incompetent way. And arguably, getting U.S. troops on the ground in Vietnam was the incompetent way. I mean, JFK only weeks before his own death had the president of South Vietnam killed. JFK had enough of the ally that the United States had in the very tenuous and strange South Vietnamese government. President Diem, I don't know if you might know how to pronounce that better than me. Is it? Some people say Diem. Huh?
Diem.
Yeah, Diem. President Diem. Kennedy had him killed. Not fully on purpose. He only asked for a coup, but when you order a coup in Saigon in 1963, the guy gets killed. But, I mean, that's a very good question. Would Kennedy have tried to stick to sort of more cloak and dagger operations? Would he tried to do something entirely different, or would he also would have put American troops on the ground in Vietnam? I don't know. What I do know is that this far more consequential and far more important Cold War turning point, which was Indonesia, ends up overshadowed by Vietnam because Vietnam involves American boys. Even though Indonesia is a much more important country, and everybody understood this in the early 1960s, Kennedy's administration understood this, Johnson's administrations understood this, Vietnam ends up becoming the giant thing that hangs over the American psyche because American citizens get involved in this unending, horrific conflict that we don't win. Whereas the quote-unquote victory of Indonesia happens in 4 to 6 months, and no American soldiers get hurt. There's not a scratch on the head of a single American. So it's just kind of, it falls immediately deep into the memory hole because this horrible conflict in Vietnam ends up dominating U.S. ideas about Asia for the next 10 years.
So this Indonesian conquest, whatever one wants to call it, it's successful. This becomes the title of your book. I mean, not because of that, but the Jakarta method, it's successful. So this becomes a phrase that is used in circles, correct?
Yes. As I said, we've totally forgotten about it now, but people active in the international left and right in 1964, 65, they really knew about Sukarno. They really knew about the Indonesian Communist Party. This was a hugely important country. And on the one hand, on the left side of the aisle around the world, a lot of socialist movements radicalized, believing that if they didn't become more dictatorial, if they didn't become more militaristic, they could be killed too. And then on the right side of the aisle, among Washington's allies and potential allies in the anti-communist international movement, especially in Latin America, but also in parts of Asia, everyone saw, okay, well, that works. Not only does it work, you get away with it. Not only did Suharto establish power very effectively, he entered the team of favored nations. He's now a friend of the free world. He's now a business partner of Wall Street. He is now accepted into the gang of quote-unquote good guys on the globe. So not only can we do that if we need to, it'll work, we'll get away with it. Washington will play defense for us. And this is exactly what happens in Latin America. The phrase Jakarta as metaphor for mass murder, it's kind of accidental that it was Jakarta because Jakarta wasn't even the worst violence. Most of the violence happened out in the countryside where it was easier to hide what you were doing. But in 1970, Salvador Allende is elected president of Chile. And Salvador Allende is a friend of Fidel. He is very much a leftist, but he believes in the democratic path to socialism. Now, Richard Nixon, who was the same vice president that said that democracy was a bad thing for Indonesia because the left was going to win, Richard Nixon orders the CIA to stop Allende from even taking office. We now, again, know from declassified files, we can see the conversations Nixon had. His problem with Allende was not that he thought he was going to form an alliance with Moscow or that he would ruin Chile. His fear was precisely that Allende would be successful and inspire other countries to try democratic socialism. This could not be tolerated. As Allende takes office, because the initial CIA attempts at a coup fail, and this is the same kind of thing we see over and over. They try and they fail and they try and they get caught and they try and it's a big mess, but they don't have to stop. So Allende is president, and the Brazilian US-backed dictatorship, which took over in 1964 in a process broadly similar to what happened in Indonesia, although not nearly as violent. The Brazilian military is collaborating with the Chilean military to try to help them do a coup. They're giving them advice and they're talking about how the Chilean military could prepare the grounds to take over from Allende and create their own right-wing dictatorship. So in 1972, on the streets of Salvador, graffiti starts appearing, and that graffiti says, "Jakarta is coming." And people get postcards in the mail, and it says, "Jakarta is coming," or just Jakarta. And the message that this sends is very clear to people that have been paying attention to world history in the last 5 to 10 years, is this means we're going to kill you. This means we're going to do what they did in Indonesia. We're going to take power away from you, and you're going to die. I spent a lot of time getting to know a Chilean woman who got one of these postcards. And very tragically, that's exactly what happened. In 1973, the coup happens, and Jakarta does come. They killed her husband. They killed thousands of people in Chile. Chile and Brazil end up forming, along with other countries in South America, a grand alliance to carry out terror against each other's population. They create something called Operation Condor, which is an apparatus, again, supported by the United States, which would allow them to hunt down and kill people across the continent, even if they had escaped from this or that dictatorship. And again, those people on the right that thought we can get away with this and Washington will play defense for us, they were right. That's exactly what happened.
As we wind down, I think one of the things that strikes me about this conversation are labels, that we have these labels. And to me, it sure looks like when I go through your work, the little bit that I know about history, that in every country, regardless of its place and its timeline of where it is and its development coming out of a war, going into a war, whatnot, that invariably there is going to be people at the top that are there with power, whatever they call themselves. I mean, like right now, plenty of Americans want to think that we are this republic, we're this democracy, everything is super fair and all this other. Give me a break. Everyone that goes to DC right now is getting super rich. You know, I mean, come on. I mean, Hillary Clinton's worth $250 million. I mean, give me a break. The reality is, it sure seems like that's what's going on. Then for me, it seems like that if we can all kind of analyze each country and whatnot, it comes down to, is there a ruler, is there a leader of that country that is benevolent? Singapore is very small. But I always say to people, like, look, Singapore is small. Okay, we can't extrapolate too much from that. And I'm sure he's got mistakes somewhere. But when I look at Lee Kuan Yew and I say, okay, you know, he's a benevolent dictator. Living under a benevolent dictator, if you truly have one. Americans, we like to say, we got all these votes. We can vote. Okay, give me a break. Give me a break. I mean, the reality is people just want to be able to get up, work, make some money, go to a restaurant, eat, hang out, have some freedom. And there's a lot of different ways to get there.
Yeah, well, when I moved to Asia, and I'm sure this is an experience you had as well, is that you meet people that straight up aren't Democrats. You meet people in Asia that are straight up like, no, it's a bad system. I mean, I'm an American. That doesn't enter into my brain as a possible thought. But what I will say is that if it's even possible to look at our system and think that it's such an imperfect democracy that it's comparable to a quote unquote benevolent dictator, that's a big problem. I do think that no matter how much I believe in democracy, it's not looking good. At the very least, we're having a bad PR moment in world history. People in Asia that look at the United States and say, well, okay, should we do that? It doesn't look great right now. And I think that every person does have a vote. I don't think there's some dark power that pulls the strings. I think everyone has a vote, and I think this is uncontroversial. Liberal academics and conservative thinkers and people on the far left all kind of recognize that if you, in the liberal capitalist system, in the free market representative democracy that we have in the United States, if you have economic power, that translates to political power. So while everybody has a vote, if you have a lot of money, you have a lot more influence over the state. And I think that's not controversial, really. We don't maybe like to talk about it that much.
I don't see it's controversial at all. But again, you're right. I don't think in America, we don't like to talk about that. We go bound to
We don't like to talk about the consequences, what that means, right? And looking at all these covert operations, there was this big recurring question. It's like, well, did America try to topple these countries and do these horrible things because they were too worried about communism? Or was it big financial interests that pressed them to do it? I don't think it has to be either or.
Is there a third option, as you mentioned, for example, with LBJ, that just some of our decision makers were just fucking idiots?
I think that all of human history, that's about a third of the explanation, no matter what happens.
Excuse my French.
At any moment in human history, the contingency inserted to the system by human stupidity is always present. But I think to understand fully the actions of the United States, what kind of an entity it is and how it interacts around the world, you have to be conscious of the fact that economic power translates into control over the state. Not full control. I don't think there's someone behind the curtain pulling all the strings, but you have much more power over, we don't hide it, right? That's why lobbyists exist. That's why major corporations spend millions of dollars to influence the government. It works. If we enter an era of extreme inequality, as we have recently, that only becomes more pronounced. While everybody still has a vote, and that matters. You can tell elections matter because even the very powerful people freak out about their outcomes. I think they really matter and every vote matters. But the greater extent to which we have a tiny class of people with huge amounts of political power, the more that we're going to see them having influence over the state. And I think this is especially true in foreign policy because foreign policy is a lot to think about. I mean, for the average American that wants to go through the day, that wants to work, go to the restaurant, have a nice time with their family, get a good night's sleep, it's very hard to keep up what's happening in 180 countries around the world. As a result of that dynamic, I think that the vote that each person has becomes relatively smaller when it comes to foreign policy because the average American doesn't have interest in Indonesia Whereas a couple big corporations really might, and a couple sectors within the foreign policy establishment really might. Yeah, I think we have to be mindful of the way that democracy can be distorted by economic power.
Let me share one with you really quick as we close out. The first time I was in mainland China, 2013, I landed on a red eye from Bangkok. I was going for a speaking gig, so okay, yes, they're going to be nice to me and all that kind of stuff, whatever. What I'm going to tell you it's never happened anywhere else. I land on a red eye. It's like 5:30. I look like a bag of you-know-what. 5:30 a.m. They meet me at the airport, 3 guys and this one chubby lady who's like 5 foot tall. And she is holding a massive bouquet of flowers to hand me. I spent a couple weeks there, go all around. Everyone's nice to me. Okay, you can feel it's different. It's whatever. But I look at something like 2020. Okay, yes, this has happened. This virus is terrible. And perhaps things have been covered up in Wuhan and all kinds of stuff. And perhaps this and perhaps that. Maybe we'll find out some really bad things. Okay, America's done some really bad things too, as you mentioned in the very beginning of this conversation. But the reality is, in 2020, when I hear Americans just start screaming, China, communist, bad, and I'm thinking, you have never been there. You have never broke bread with these folks. You've never tried to use chopsticks even,
And I mean, I absolutely believe that the Chinese government is guilty of very serious human rights abuses. And I think in a lot of ways, I would not want to live under that system. However, do I think that the United States is freaking out about China because they are mistreating Muslims in Western China? Or do I think that it is a defensive power move as they sense the arrival of another competing power? Unfortunately, I think the second one is more likely. I mean, if the United States really, really cared about the treatment of Muslims in the quote-unquote war on terror, we wouldn't have killed hundreds of thousands in Iraq.
Do you ever get a headache that you know too much?
I mean, this book, I'm okay now, and I feel very even sort of guilty or pathetic to admit this because the people that I spent time getting to know over the last 3 years have been through actual suffering. But this book was very difficult psychologically to go through. I mean, not only are just the stories awful, just it's so hard to integrate the knowledge of what happened in that part of the world and how much it shaped globalization to this day, and also just live my normal life, drive my car and stop at Subway and pick which kind of sauce I want on the sandwich or whatever. Like, it was a sort of profoundly jarring cognitive dissonance that I went through.
I hope the CIA doesn't pick you up.
I think that they know that I don't matter. I think that they know. I think that they know. I mean, I'm not like the whistleblower or whatever, It's been the heroic
But
work
sometimes the storyteller, the synthesizer, pulls it all together, right? It was good talking to you, though. Seriously. I mean, even if you go away,
thank you so much.
No.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it was good talking with you, even if you go away. Hopefully you won't go away.
I don't know. We're all going away eventually. It's fine. I'll be all right.
I didn't mean that going away of the podcast. I meant, the other going away.
Yeah, I know. That's fine.
So listen, the book, The Jakarta Method, Washington's Anti-Communist Crusade, the Mass Murder Program That Shaped Our World. That's a pretty grabbing title. I really think it's a great history lesson. It really, post-World War II, it gives people a perspective. Look, a lot of good things have happened in the world too. And even when I was trying to say some good things about China, you reminded me like, hey, hold on, Mike, there's some bad things going on too. But I think there's always these poles in any country where there's some good and some bad. I love the fact that you've taken the time to put this together. I know how much time it must have taken, just a tremendous amount of work.
Thanks for having me and thanks for looking at it. I appreciate anybody that has the time to read it and think through these issues with me.
Hey, where is the best place to send people? The book, Amazon, all those fun places. Is there a website you want to drive people to? A Twitter account, anything?
People can buy the book wherever they want. On my own personal website, I set up a page, which is just thejakartamethod.com, which is an easy way to remember it. And that'll send you to all kinds of different options, including around the world, or if you want to avoid Amazon. But really, it's everywhere. And yeah, I'm on Twitter as well, Vincent Bevins. People want to follow me. I'm in Brazil now, sort of trying to keep up day to day with the consequences of the Bolsonaro government during this pandemic. And he, of course, his legacy is the same as the Jakarta Method too. I just appreciate any interest anyone has in the book.
Hey, Vincent, I appreciate you coming on. Thank you.
Thank you.
My guest today is Alexander Osterwalder. He has written a bunch of really cool business books, not only from the content, but from the design perspective. And now, along with his co-authors, they have another one, The Invincible Company, How to Constantly Reinvent Your Organization with Inspiration from the World's Best Business Models. I really like that perspective. What's the business model? Don't necessarily tell me about the product or the service or whatever. Talk about the model. What's a good model? Who has the good models? Why do they work? That to me seems like a hell of a smart direction to go in. And not surprisingly to you, probably, especially for those of you that have seen my books, even though Alex and his team are going into businesses, this conversation to me starts to sound a lot like trend following. Models for business, models for trend following, a bunch of small losses and a few big winners. Without any further delay, let me jump right into my conversation with Alexander Osterwalder. So here's where I want to jump in, Alex. Something about me briefly. I write these investment books and I've written them for 15 years. There's 5 of them. There's a certain thinking, a certain philosophical thinking to these investment books. I could not help but think when I saw your work, I was like, well, gosh, if we can't have a good conversation, there's something wrong with us. Here's the crux of these investment books. Not buy and hold, not value investing, anything like that. It's all predicated on the idea of having a diversified portfolio. From that portfolio at the beginning of the year, one has no idea what's going to happen. However, whichever market goes your way, momentum-wise, you get on and you go with it. At the end of the year, you have something like 30 or 40% winners. Your winners are much bigger than your losers, but you're going to have a lot of small losses on your way to trying to find a big unexpected gain. Gee, that sounds a lot like your world, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, that's what we try to bring to companies when they invest in new ideas. They have the same approach. They have a portfolio. The most important aspect of that is that senior leaders need to understand that exploitation of existing business models and the search and exploration of new ones is fundamentally different. When you search for outliers, but you really don't know which one is going to win, you actually need to spread your portfolio and invest in many, many, many ideas so that one can really take off. You can't pick the winner. That's the fundamental thesis in innovation exploration. And that's how venture capitalists have always invested because they know they can't pick the winner. But I think this is now increasingly getting into the corporate world. And I'm not talking about just corporate venture capital. I'm talking about internal projects. And how do you really do this to let the winners emerge? You kind of need to create this internally in your organization for winners to emerge because you can't pick them. You don't know. Nobody's been in the future. So there's no chance you can pick them.
Now, you talk about this, and I'll let you give your feelings on it as well. Jeff Bezos talks about it in his shareholder letters. He talks about this very issue. If you were to sit down and you have a chance to talk with a lot of interesting people at a lot of interesting companies, yes, people have seen your work. Yes, a lot of significant people go, oh, yes, this is a no-brainer. I need to adopt this mindset right now. However, there's still pushback. There's still people that kind of say, no way.
They actually never say no way. They just say, wow, this is hard. Because while it's very clear and it looks easy, it's incredibly hard to put in place because you need to basically build 2 cultures under the same roof. It's not that everybody needs to be an innovator, like a business model innovator and create the next Amazon Web Services. You need to have a world-class execution culture, those who manage the existing businesses. And in parallel, you need a world-class exploration culture. And that is very different. That's really hard to pull off because investment style is different. The culture is different. It's not execution, it's iteration. You actually need to fail a lot. It's very hard to build that second culture in a world that's dominated by execution. I rarely hear anybody say, nah, this doesn't work. It makes 100% sense, in particular because now we have good examples where that worked. Amazon is a great one, probably most cited. The one I liked a lot is Ping An from China. Within 7 years, they transformed from a financial conglomerate focused on banking and insurance to become a technology company in 7 years. And the only way they could do that and pull it off is by building this culture of exploration where it's okay to fail. Peter Ma, the founder, put in place with Jessica Tan, a co-CEO, who had the mandate to turn Ping An into a tech company. And Peter Ma said, you're not going to get it right because we don't know how to do this. You just need to try, explore, and we will get there. That culture of failing a lot is hard to implement. It's also very long-term. One of the things you hear a lot from senior leaders, from CEOs, oh, we can't do long-term because the stock market is short-term, et cetera. And that is true to a certain extent, but sometimes it sounds a little bit like an excuse. I know it sounds, okay, what is this guy saying? He's never managed a multi-billion-dollar company. But I talk to these CEOs, they get it, but they also see, they're very receptive to hear the examples of those CEOs who've done it. A good one is Paul Polman, because with Jeff Bezos, it's easy. He's a majority owner of the votes, so he can do whatever he wants. But take Paul Polman, who, when he took over Unilever as CEO, first thing he did is he abolished quarterly reporting. And he said, we're going to do yearly reporting because we're in it for the long term. So if you're interested in quarterly returns, don't invest in us. So he's very clear. The reason he did that is because he wanted, and they really put this in place in Unilever to become a company that's focused on sustainability, growth, and profit. Not two topics that should be at the expense of each other, growth and profit and sustainability, but in harmony. He was able to pull it off. So there are companies or there are leaders that are able to do this, but it's really hard. That's what leaders see first. Wow, this is going to be hard to create A, a long-term culture, B, a culture where failure is okay, and then C, completely different investment style where you actually embrace risk, you manage risk, you embrace it, you don't make crazy bets, you make a lot of bets. It's really hard. But now what's really great to see is a lot of CEOs are starting to get there.
Let me bring it back to quarterly returns in a second. That really spurred a thought in me. But I wanted to bring up two quick examples as we talk, because you're kind of describing something like, okay, here's the ongoing business, but we need to have this kind of side project. I mean, I'm kind of generalizing here, and these aren't the terms you would use, but in many ways, I can think back to Ma Bell, the phone company in the States. We all learned later on they had Bell Labs, where all these math geniuses were doing all this cool stuff like Claude Shannon, et cetera. But I could also think of, if I watched the movie The Dark Knight, there's Morgan Freeman who's handling the front end of Wayne Enterprises, and the young accountant is like, hey, what's this off the book stuff? What is all this Batman stuff? There's this whole side project going on. But I think what's interesting about the quarterly returns aspect, if I want to compare it to my world as well, if you focus on quarterly returns, you're focusing on consistency. You're pretending that you can kind of force the market to give you something consistently. Whereas if you say no to quarterly returns, you don't have a constraint that's artificial to begin with, because if you don't make any money, for example, in the trading world, if you don't make any money for 11 months and you're flat or whatever, or let's use right now, the first couple months of the year, not much is going on. All of a sudden, a trading strategy that is faced with a March 2020 has all kinds of opportunity. You couldn't predict that. You couldn't plan that. You had to be ready for something like that.
Absolutely. So there's two things to that. The first one is that you need to have the predictability in your execution business. So it's okay to have a business where you say, we need predictability. When you're managing a business, you know the customers, you know the channels, you know the environment. There is no room for big failures. We need to be good at that part. But we need the additional part where we're extremely strong at experimentation and adaptation, and we're extremely strong at portfolio management, making many, many small bets and just investing more in those bets that are showing signs of success. Again, exploit, explore. But I'll bring it back to what you said at the beginning, the side projects. That's exactly the problem, that today in most companies, exploration is a side project. It's not strategic. then it doesn't work. Steve Blank, who launched the whole lean startup movement, changed the way entrepreneurship is taught. He likes to say that's innovation theater. If you don't make it strategic, if you don't make exploration strategic, you're never going to get good at it. And you're never going to find the next big growth engines. And that's exactly why most companies are really bad at growth and transformation. That's why a lot of companies today are struggling in this very uncertain environment, because they've never built a strong strategic exploration capability. So they're extremely good at execution, but execution only works when your environment is relatively stable. That is definitely not the case now. What you'll see is that those companies that were good in times of stability already then to explore, they're good now. They're ready for this really, really crazy environment where nothing is certain. All the variables have changed. You can really see now which companies are prepared to explore because they can turn around their business very quickly. The last thing really to emphasize here is one is not more important than the other. Because you can see companies that started to really explore, I'd take GE as an example, they were relatively good at putting in place exploratory capabilities, but they really struggled in the execution part. Their core business was not strong enough. The exploration didn't make up for their deficiencies in the exploitation part. You can't do one or the other, it's an and. That's the thing. It's not a side project. And maybe, a way to frame it is also today innovators like to call themselves pirates. That's silly, because what did we do historically with pirates? We killed them. Don't call yourself a pirate. Become a bit more strategic. So a friend of mine who's part of the Strategizer team, thought leader, Tendai Vicky, he likes to say, well, Alex, but they're pirates in the Navy where you actually have a legitimacy to explore. We really need to give innovation, exploration, an important strategic mandate in the company. These are not side projects. As long as they're side projects, you'll never look like Amazon. When you start to make it strategic, you'll look a lot more like Amazon and like Ping An, but it's really hard to pull off.
I knew you were going to not like that term side project. My mind was scanning for something a little more robust and a little more equal to the other side of the coin, the existing biz side. Just a quick side self-promotion here. Steve Blank has been on this podcast. He's coming on again soon. And also, too, I should give it a little self-promotion to your book, which I have a fine copy of in my hands. Our conversation today, and I can't say this about a lot of books, but our conversation today has no chance to show the detail that exists in this book. It just has no chance because, with all due respect, your book is kind of like computer code in a way. It really is. It's like code. It's a system. We're having a conversation about that system. We're picking out some general topic areas and whatnot. But this is really a dense read. As you have been saying from the start here, this is kind of hard. Hell, when you start to look at the details of what it encompasses, just making the shift, how you guys write it out, that's hard alone.
The way I look at innovation and exploration is that it's really starting to become a profession. I think of it more as finance and accounting, where you can't just go to a weekend workshop and then you're a world-class finance person or a world-class accountant, or I even like to use the medical profession. You don't go to a weekend workshop and then you do a new kind of surgical procedure. These are things that you need to learn. They're not easy. So what we try to do is make it as simple, as practical as possible with the little pieces, and then you put the little pieces together to get the bigger piece. So for me, the analogy of the surgeon or doctor is probably the best. You need to be able to study anatomy and physiology to understand the basics. Same in business, exploration, understand the fundamentals of business models and value propositions. Sounds kind of trivial, but it's not. And then you start to get good at snipping around on dead bodies when you're a doctor before you ever get to touch a real body. So you need to just build it up. That's, I think, where innovation is today. It used to be the Wild West, and we could say, oh, we're going to do this lean startup thing. We're going to do experimentation and failure, and we're going to get it right. Well, that used to be the case 10 years ago. Today, there are ways to measure the reduction of risk and uncertainty. So it's almost getting boring because we're leaving the Wild West behind us because now we know how to do it. It's resembling accounting a lot more, which also means if you want to get good at this, You need to put in a lot of hours to learn the fundamentals and practice, because it's just like in medicine and in sports, etc. You don't become world class at something overnight. The good news is now there are the tools and processes and ways to learn to get better at this. But more like cycling, you have to do it to understand, right? You can't just learn it theoretically. That's a big challenge.
Let me keep you at culture for a moment. We kind of hinted at this, but I want you to really define, because if we take the innovation arm, first off, it's the existing business. We've got the innovation arm, and I know you would like to see these positioned as kind of equal units for ultimate long-term success. But the culture of these two sides of the coin, the existing biz and the innovation arm, these cultures are very different. I can see if you're attempting to introduce this into an existing culture already, it's going to be very, very difficult. Speak to the idea of these two cultures, and ultimately I think competing's the right word, but they're just very different.
They're not competing. Yeah, that's correct. They're very, very different. That's also correct. And that's the challenge. One culture, the execution culture, the exploit culture, and running a business, the management culture, is about planning and execution. What's our target? How do we get from here to there to meet the target? We can predict. There is some predictability, and you need to meet the plan. It's execution. That's where business plans actually make sense. When we explore, there's no value in making a business plan of how we're going to execute from idea to business, because your idea is a fantasy. So what you really need to do is plan how you're going to constantly experiment and adapt. You have an idea for a new market opportunity, to new technology. The difficult part is not the idea. The idea is free. They're everywhere. The difficult part is, how can I rapidly turn an idea and opportunity into a value proposition that customers care about, embedded in a business model that can scale? And how can I do that fast and systematically? Speed is essential. Experimentation is essential. But when you experiment, you're going to fail a lot because you don't know what works. But you're not going to punish failure. You're going to encourage systematic, manageable, cheap failure so you can constantly adapt your idea in lightning speed until you know what's really going to work. Those two cultures are fundamentally different. So what does that mean? Oh, yeah, we're going to try to create these two cultures. It's not good enough. You need to design and manage those two cultures and how they coexist. You need to build the bridges. Now, how do you do that? It's not that hard from a theoretical point of view. It's hard to implement. You need to put in place the right kind of leadership system in terms of support, in terms of what do you reward, in terms of what does management spend time with, in terms of all those kind of things, resource allocation. The second aspect is organizational design. You need to create an org chart where both cultures have a powerful place to live. And we like to call that the chief execution officer on the one hand and the chief entrepreneur on the other hand, and they're equal. It's not one reports to the other, they're equal. And when ideas become mature enough from the entrepreneurial ecosystem, you throw them over. When they're protected enough, you throw them over to the execution system. So you don't have turf fights. Who's going to keep the best idea? No, one is exploration, one is execution. And then the last piece is you need to just manage the tools differently. The exploitation side, the traditional one that we know, managing a business, those are different tools than the exploration side. So you need to work on all levels. And we like to say they're enablers that you can put in place and blockers that you need to eliminate, and your culture will emerge. You can't just change behaviors like that. You need to work on the blockers and the enablers, and you can design and manage culture. So again, it's a fuzzy term, culture, but we now figured out over years of failing at this, we now figured out how you can design those two different cultures and make them live in harmony. It's hard to pull off, but it's possible. Again, it's not rocket science. You just need to have the energy and commitment to do it. Usually, when the management is fully behind it, it's possible. It's rare that when the management is fully behind it, that they can't pull it off. It never works when the management is not behind it.
I don't think you're going to correct me here. I'll be surprised if you do, but hey, I'm about to throw a shot in the dark, an educated shot in the dark. Here we are in March 2020. The world is in the middle of all kinds of chaos. And so there's going to be a lot of people post this period of time where there will be all these, quote, new techniques that supposedly have come from this experience. I can't imagine that there's anything about your work in this book that is somehow or another affected by the current chaos. Because I would argue that you guys have already built in to your work the opportunity for these kinds of game changers to exist. That's the whole point of having an adaptable, systematic approach.
Absolutely. It's all about resilience. So we arrogantly called it the invincible company. The truth, of course, is, and that's what we're seeing now, is practically no company is invincible, but you can build really, really strong resilience if you have those two cultures. Absolutely, you can see today already those companies that built in that resilience, that ability to be extremely adaptive, they're having a much easier time to survive in these turbulent days because they have an exploration culture that is going to help the execution culture kind of survive. I don't think this is irrelevant at all. And I was asking myself, is it even relevant or is it insensitive to launch a book during these uncertain times? So I put up a Twitter poll, and within hours, we had 1,500 votes where over 85%, I think it was 84, 85% said, Alex, go on with the book launch. This is extremely relevant for the world we were in. Now, of course, if we look at today, this is an atomic bomb type of scenario. No company can ever be prepared for something of this order of magnitude because otherwise you wouldn't be able to manage in more calmer times. However, those companies that have more resilience built in are better prepared for this. If you need to put these things in place because the world is going to be more uncertain. Now we have extreme uncertainty, but in general, it's much harder to predict where the world is going. Technology, competitors, it's crazy time.
I want to use two examples, and you can run with this opening salvo for me. But if I look at something, if I look at the current times right now, and this is just picking two headline companies, Boeing and Apple. Okay, and let's just pretend that resilience is how much cash you have in the bank, because that seems to be a pretty good measure of resilience right now. And Boeing has decided in the last handful of years that we were going to really got all this great innovation, this company that produces these planes, these 787s, really cool to fly on, great experience. But the managers decided, hey, let's boost share value. Let's take our cash and do these buybacks and all this kind of stuff. Well, Apple, I don't know exactly what they've done, but I know they sit on a mountain of cash. They're different models and all that stuff. I'm not trying to make an exact comp, but the mindset is definitely different. You have to think that part of that Apple mindset goes back to Jobs and perhaps the experiences he had early on, that when he had a chance to start to assemble on his second round of being a CEO, he had a chance to assemble a mountain of cash. It seems like, as an outsider looking in, he really thought, gosh, you know what? This is my resilience. Let me keep some cash in the bank, a lot of cash in the bank. Whereas now we have a nuclear bomb drop, so to speak, in March of 2020, and a lot of companies could have had that cash, and they don't.
Yeah, that's definitely essential, the cash that you have. And what you can clearly see is those organizations that use their cash to buy back shares, or those organizations that invest in the future in exploration, not just technology innovation. Innovation is not R&D. Innovation is exploring new value propositions and new business models. Those who invested that cash into exploration, like Ping An, for example, like Amazon, like Apple before, when Steve Jobs took over. Now they have so much cash that they're starting to buy back shares as well. They don't know what to do with it. But those companies are more resilient. So it's not just the cash itself that you have now to survive, but it's also how did you invest the cash before? Because here's the thing. If you take Apple as an example, they're suffering today as well. But their business model will survive because it's an incredibly powerful business model. They're not just playing in an industry. They built an ecosystem of a business model with app developers, everything fits together, and there are huge moats around that business model. If you take a company like Boeing, They put themselves into one concrete industry. Today, industry-based business models are a lot more vulnerable than those that transcend industry boundaries, those that have a business model as unit of analysis and not the industry. There are a couple of things that I would say went wrong. And again, I've never managed a company of the size of Boeing, but there are a couple of things that went wrong at Boeing. And the big one was to focus purely on execution, getting leaner and leaner in the traditional sense to an extreme where they did illegal stuff, but they never really used any of the cash to build exploratory capabilities or to build a stronger business model. They milked and milked and milked an existing business model that was increasingly outdated. Today, if you define yourself by your industry, you're not going to survive for long. When a crisis like today, this atomic bomb drops, is just going to accelerate your mortality, your corporate mortality. So I like to say that companies that focus purely on efficiency and cost cutting and getting better only at what they're already good at, they're actually more efficiently dying because they're cutting out everything that allows them to be ready for the future. And that's exactly what happened at Boeing. Not a case that I know extremely well, but that I followed from the sidelines, also through Rita McGrath, who has written a lot about some of the mistakes they made at Boeing. And that's what you see in companies today, I think, before the crisis, and you'll see it afterwards. Those companies that just get better at what they're already good at, they're increasing their likelihood of corporate death. Those companies that build exploratory capabilities, and I call this business R&D, business research and development, not just technological R&D, because that's a subset of innovation, but the ability to launch, explore, and then launch new value propositions and business models, those companies will win. We can already see the winners emerging. Today, it's a little bit anecdotal, and there's a lot of luck. It depends on one good leader. But we have the code now. There are a lot of thinkers who've been working on this. Now the only thing is, how do we make it practical so leaders finally implement this? It's not a question mark anymore. How do you do this? The question mark is only, when are leaders finally going to change? Again, I'm not trying to say, this is easy to do. The courageous leaders are starting to do this, and this crisis will accelerate that move by 100.
By the way, I've not paid you to name drop your associates who have appeared on this podcast. Rita McGrath has also appeared on this podcast. Hey, quick question, just a big picture one. The invincible company, this term, invincible versus monopoly, what kind of headspace are we touching on here?
Yeah, of course. Once you become practically invincible, you say, okay, the monopoly brings you into the invincible space. Now, I do believe that innovation, and obviously, it's kind of a hard argument to make when you have companies like Apple and Amazon and Facebook and so dominating the world. But I do believe that innovation will always try to kind of kill the companies at the top. That's why the only way they can stay ahead is actually not to build a monopoly. A powerful business model is a great way to build a fortress, but it's not enough. I believe that every company, even with their fortress, they have to, in order to stay ahead, they have to be able to reinvent themselves all the time. If you take Apple, they're so powerful because they never stopped for a long time, let's say under the Steve Jobs, they never stopped reinventing their business model. It wasn't just the technology, it was really reinventing the business model. Same with Amazon. Yes, of course, they have a stronghold on many industries, but what's keeping them ahead is not just focusing on those, but it's constantly exploring new areas. You could say Amazon was dominating e-commerce, but that was not the best business to be in because the margins are laser thin. It's not profitable at all. But they constantly explored, and that's how many things that were successful emerged, like Amazon Web Services. And Amazon Web Services is so much more profitable, and now analysts used to hate that, now they love it. That was an exploratory capability. So it's actually not the focusing on a monopoly. Amazon could have focused just on e-commerce. But no, they said, this is the thing about Jeff Bezos. He's obsessed by the fact that Amazon as a company could die. He actually doesn't even formulate it as it could. He says, inevitably, every company dies. So the only thing you can do is keep a culture of day one. So monopoly is not good enough. Monopoly is not good enough. You'll be either disrupted by competitors or you'll be taken apart by the government. You need to constantly explore. And that's what we call invincible companies. They're not even happy with striving for monopoly. They think that even that is not enough. They need to constantly reinvent themselves because inevitably every company will die.
Okay, here's a great example. So let's just keep it at Amazon for a second. I posted something roughly about this thought earlier today or yesterday, and I was talking about the United States Postal Service. They're saying right now, if the USPS does not get a bailout in the next couple months, it's toast. Well, Americans have been hearing that the U.S. Postal Service has been basically bankrupt for decades. Anyone that knows anything about that system, I mean, it's just the most inefficient. It's basically Newman from the Seinfeld show in real life, and this is what it is. However, what's really interesting is that Jeff Bezos has used the United States Postal Service as part of his foundation to become perhaps the wealthiest guy in the world. Now, at some point in time, I'm sure he thinks about this all the time. And look, I give Bezos all the credit for figuring out that inefficiency, meaning, okay, I want to start a delivery company. It's more than just a delivery company, but I want to start this company that utilizes delivery. I've got the United States Postal Service. Wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. However, he must be worried every day or be thinking about every day what happens if that government service goes away, because that's an integral part of his business.
Oh, yeah. And I think that's exactly why Amazon continues to explore, because this is in the mindset of Amazon. Inevitably, the pieces that work today, they will die. So they start exploring with new ways to replace everything that could die. And they're constantly trying to figure out how could they get better. And not just from a company perspective. I mean, what's incredibly ingrained in their culture is always at the service of the customer. They always have this attitude of day one. They believe we're really powerful now, but it's going to go away. It's going to go away. So we need to continue to explore. How can we get better? How can we figure out those pieces that will fall away? How can we replace them? There are a lot of things we can criticize about Amazon and Jeff Bezos. Absolutely. But there are a lot of things that we also need to admire. And I think the biggest one is this willingness to always explore and always be able to think about replacing all of the pieces. Because the danger in general is when you're successful, you get complacent. I'll give you an example of a company. I won't mention the name, but it was in Asia. Went to a company and we went to the headquarters. It's a huge company. And they said, hey, Alex, look, this is our building. We call it 100 years. Because they were proud of the 100 years of existence of this company. And that's great. Then I told them, well, you know how Amazon calls their headquarters? Day one, right? So do you see the difference in attitude? And I'm not saying you shouldn't be proud of existing for 100 years, but when you're about the 100 years, you're getting relaxed and say, hey, we're on top of the world. You can't have that attitude. You always need to have that attitude of day one. I think that's one of the things that is admirable at Amazon, with all the flaws that the company has, is there is this attitude of day one all the time. They're trying not to be arrogant in the sense that it can always go away. They might come across as arrogant because they're so big and powerful, but the attitude is always, this can go away. We need to get better. We need to get better every day. And that is pretty amazing. And not just better at efficiency innovation, but also better at building the fundamentals, like the delivery system.
Let me give something tangible. I'm looking at a screenshot that I put on my big screen here. It's from your book. It says, what about your industry? And let me read a few details from this to paint a picture for the audience. The top line is industry, disruptor, and to be disrupted, 3 columns. And the first column, industry, you have messaging, the disruptor, WhatsApp, WeChat. Industry, auto, the disruptor, Tesla. Industry, retail, the disruptor, Amazon, Alibaba, and so on. For example, the industry, taxi, Uber, Didi. And then over on the other column, the far right column, to be disrupted, banking, pharmaceuticals, legal services, education. My gosh, especially when you're looking at right now what's happening in March 2020, banking, pharmaceuticals, education. I mean, how much can you start to imagine that education can possibly be disrupted when we've literally taken billions of kids and taking them out of school, and somehow or another in 2020, we can't teach these kids online immediately? It is an absolute abysmal performance for the adults in our society that we could not pivot and teach these kids from home on a dime.
It's crazy. This is a huge accelerator of transformation. Now we're seeing which business models or which industries are struggling most. What strikes me always, and this is where take Vinod Kosh likes to talk about this, he says innovation happens at the fringes, and Rita McGrath talks about this a lot. So far, the companies have rarely been the transformers of industries, but it's slowly happening. I do think, take Ping An, which is one of my favorite examples at the moment. Again, this used to be a finance conglomerate. Well, guess what? They're now running the biggest health platform on the planet with Ping An Good Doctor. It is close to 300 million people, the users. This did not come from a pharmaceutical company. This did not come from a healthcare company. This came from a banking and insurance conglomerate. Wow. It is happening now that the established players are starting to understand if they don't reinvent themselves and the arenas they play in, they're going to die. They're going to get disrupted. So far, I'd say still 95% of the large corporations that I meet, the CEOs that I talk to, they're still in this old mindset of we're going to protect our business model in our industry, et cetera. And only few are really moving. They all get it. We have great conversations, but the move needs to be so bold. That's what Peter Ma did with Ping An. The move needs to be so bold, not to make big crazy bets, but to build the culture. It's not about big and crazy bets. Actually, we've seen a lot of those and they all went south. One of my favorite examples is Flow TV by Qualcomm. That was a big and crazy bet. Well, guess what? It failed. They had to fire the few customers they had. This was mobile TV in the US. They had to fire the few customers they had because it was a silly big bet. Making bold moves is not about making big, crazy bets. It's about creating the ecosystem that allows the crazy ideas that have potential to emerge phase by phase. That's what leaders need to do. But to put that in place, they need to radically transform the org chart. They need to radically give innovation, growth, and transformation more power. They actually probably even need to let go of a lot of power if it's not them managing growth and transformation. I like to say they need to spend 50% of their time, CEOs, he or she needs to spend 50% of their time every week on innovation. And if they don't, guess what? Innovation is not going to happen. So this transformation is possible. The disruption doesn't have to come from outside of the system, but it would require that leaders need to spend a lot more time on innovation and give innovation a lot more power in their organization. If they don't, they'll be disrupted. It's almost inevitable. I'd like to say almost because who knows? But there is a possibility. We now know how to do it. It's only a question of commitment.
I'm looking still at this chart, and I'm looking at the industries that have the disruptor next to them. Again, recruitment, LinkedIn's the disruptor, travel booking, Expedia, the disruptor, venture capital, Andreessen Horowitz, the disruptor. You can see just how clearly those industries have been disrupted. Anybody that has any kind of sense about these businesses in the business world, you just get it immediately. And then you look at the list of to be disrupted. I'm staring at healthcare, especially March 2020. And I'm thinking to myself, I pay some healthcare company about now $1,000 a month. So in case I fall on my head, my family will not be burdened with me being a vegetable. But I'm thinking the only thing that company has asked me about my health was when I signed up. Did I smoke or did I not smoke 20 years ago? Can you imagine with all, I mean, look, if you just took a bunch of smart people and sat down and, hey, let's brainstorm a little, let's try some little experiments and whatnot, who in the world would keep healthcare at such a simplistic mindset? Whereas today, and I think we're going to have a lot of data after Corona is finished, we're going to find out that some things that can unfold, for example, a pandemic that affects the lungs, if you have pre-existing health directions that you've gone, for example, smoking, that's going to probably end up being data that we have that says, gosh, that was really not wise. So you just can start to imagine the disruption that can happen. When I look at the list of the industries that have been disrupted and I look at the ones that have not been disrupted, you just shake your head and you say, gosh, how is all that opportunity still there?
Yeah, that's the right way to frame it. It's an opportunity. A couple of weeks ago, when the world was just still kind of fine, I was with a big European financial conglomerate. And I was talking to the group of CEOs there in a closed door meeting. And my point was that right now is still a great opportunity to be the leader and disrupt your industry arena because the opportunity is there. Nobody has moved dramatically enough. Asia has done it, but you take North America, you take Europe, the opportunity is still there in the financial kind of area. Finance companies could become actually big health players as well. The opportunities are there, but there are very few established companies where the leaders make the bold move to actually use that, to exploit that opportunity. Every company will say, yeah, we do innovation. Oh, we have an accelerator. So all of them are doing something, but what's lacking is the bold move to really embrace the opportunity and explore it in a strategic way. That's exactly what Ping An did, and that's what Amazon does all the time. That's what's lacking. It's not where everybody's doing innovation, but it's innovation theater. To use Steve Blank's term, which I love, what we need is bold leaders who move into those spaces. And it's not about creating just financial returns for investors and owners. It's about creating value. This is more value creation for customers, for society. So that's why I believe in this move. I'm not in it for this to just help companies make more money or investors make more money. I believe there is almost a moral obligation to help these big players innovate because they can create so much more value. And the second part is that if these big companies get better at reinventing themselves, there's also more job security. I think it's crazy to say, oh yeah, but that's the corporate life cycle. Big companies die, startups, they will take over. The human cost of a company laying off, and we're seeing this right now, the human cost of a company laying off tens of thousands of people is too big. We have to help these established companies reinvent themselves so we can create job security, so we can create more customer value.
Have you been paying attention to the news? My country just invents money to bail out anybody that made stupid moves for the last decade. I mean, come on. There's no one fails in America anymore. You just get more money to keep doing the same crap you've been doing.
It's crazy. It's crazy. But that's going to change. Rita McGrath, who's, as you said, also on your show, she's writing a lot about how these kind of big shifts might lead to also a societal change. And companies will, I believe, and this is maybe the positive attitude, I like to be a bit more positive than negative, I believe companies will change their attitude after this by a lot. Because I was in a call yesterday where somebody said companies can't trust their employees. It's really hard. And then somebody else said, well, guess what? If you treat your team, your staff, your employees in a transactional way for decades and you don't treat them right, you cannot expect that they're going to trust you. You don't even have the right to ask them to do what you're asking them to do because you never established the trust that you are a great workplace. Because 7 out of 10 people, they don't want to do what they're doing. They don't want to work where they work because companies never took their societal role. And I'm sorry for generalizing, but a lot of companies didn't take their societal role seriously enough. The time we spend at work is part of how we contribute to society. Employers and leaders have a huge role in society because we spend 8 to 16 hours per day at work. If that is a terrible experience, guess what? We're contributing towards a terrible world. If that is a great experience where people respect each other, where people are caring for each other at the workplace, we're contributing to a better world. So I'm a bit idealistic around those topics, but I do think we will see a faster shift because I've seen it already happening at some companies. But this is a catalyst. This will accelerate the shift. People will not accept the crazy bad working conditions and work environment that they had so far. And I'm talking not just about compensation, so I'm talking about culture, the respect, that people have, the care, etc. That has gone lost in many, many companies.
Let me drop a name here and let's theorize how these guys and ladies could get it turned around. United Airlines, clearly all kinds of trouble. U.S. carrier, all kinds of trouble. A lot of carriers are going to have trouble, but I can pick on United for a lot of reasons. How does a company like United, with such an installed staff base, very union, I don't think, not only the customers of United generally not happy, but the staff is usually not happy either. How can a company like that, so entrenched, make the pivot to open up to your world? I guess the ultimate question here, without picking on United too much, can some companies just literally not in this lifetime get to where you're going with the Invincible company?
I think it's possible.
Possible for everybody. You think it's not closed to any company. Any company could pivot. It might be harder for some, easier for others, but any company could pivot, in your opinion.
I believe so. And again, I'm a very positive nature, and that's maybe too optimistic, but I believe so. Again, only when the leadership is, it sounds trivial, but it's not. It means the leadership focuses on that particular goal and puts everything in place to make that happen, which means changing the org chart in a way that has never been done before. And that is exactly what you can see at companies that are great at exploration. They do this. So for me, there's the one part is how can you reinvent your business model? And then there's the other aspect, which is more about management innovation, where it's about what culture in general do you put in place? Can you create in a culture where people were seen as little cogs and weren't respected? Can you shift towards a culture of care, a culture of collaboration between leadership and team? I believe so. I've seen it happen. Some younger companies had to do radical turnarounds. At Uber, there was a terrible culture. They had to go very quickly through a turnaround. Now, did they fully get there? I would say not yet, but they had to do that change very quickly. But again, it's only when the entire leadership team is united around this. And one of the big, I'd say, shifts where, at least at the leadership level, this was an amazing shift in terms of culture, was at Ford, where Alan Mulally turned around Ford from a $17 billion loss-making monster, and they didn't get government support. They did it, or Alan Mulally did it, by changing the leadership culture, where it became a lot more responsible and collaborative. And he didn't do it by pure force, but he did it through care. And it was unbelievable. You'd say, how is that even possible that a 17 billion loss-making monster can be turned around? But we've seen a couple of those. That has to do a lot with culture. I believe it's possible. If Ford could do it with Alan Mulally, then an airline should be able to do it as well. Now, of course, it's more difficult because the atomic kind of bomb scenario that is making it very hard. I believe every company can do it. It's a leadership challenge.
Let me get one last question at you. You have a series of books here that kind of all go together. People will have to check those out on Amazon, whatnot, bookstores. This is an author question. What is the history of the design of these books? Very, I don't know what the exact word is, but very innovative design, very kind of structured in a unique way. A lot of work and a lot of thought has gone into the design of these books. This was not just done overnight.
This was not done overnight. That's absolutely right. Our books are very visual, and we don't really write books. We work on spreads, double pages, to put the concepts there and try to make them as clear, as simple, as visual, and as practical and relevant as possible. And then the text comes around it. The first one we wrote was Business Model Generation with my former PhD supervisor, Yves Pigneur. Basically, we said we can't write about business model innovation without doing it. So we asked ourselves, how would we do it? And we said, well, we'll do Kickstarter before Kickstarter existed. We'll get it crowdfinanced. We'll create a different format. And it was driven by what we liked. We said, we're going to create a book, a management book that we would love to buy. That was landscape format in incredibly or insanely visual, because I think there's things you can't describe with words. You need visuals. Visuals and words together are the best user interface for the human mind. We did that, and we hired back then Alan Smith, who's now my co-founder at Strategizer. That's how it all started out. And when we sold the publishing rights, because we self-published, when we sold the publishing rights to Wiley, I asked our editor, Richard, would you have ever allowed us to do this if we had been the traditional authors sending you a proposal? And he said, no chance, because you did everything wrong. 4-color book, landscape format. There's no chance we would have ever allowed you to do that. But the thing is, we did what we thought was right for the reader, including even myself back then. And because we've seen it was so successful, we sold millions of copies of Business Model Generation, we continued that tradition for every topic that we tackled. I believe that's the strength. And it's not visual just to put lipstick on a pig. I see really every spread, every double page in the book is like we're thinking about the user experience of every double page, of every spread. User experience and user interface. That's how we see it. So a lot of these spreads have gone through 10 to 15, some of them through, 20 iterations, including the conceptual part of the cases, where we have cases, then the visual aspect of the cases. So there's design at every single level, from the concept to the cases to the visual design. So you're right to say doesn't happen overnight.
I will say it. You don't have to say it, but I will guarantee you, I will bet my entire net worth on it. No publisher, no one that works at a publisher has ever read any of your books.
That's a bit harsh. I'm starting a conversation after. So we've been with Wiley now for 10 years. Okay. And this is our 4th book under the Strategizer series with Wiley.
I mean that from the sense, the publishing business model.
Yeah.
I think when you said they would never let you do what you described or what you ended up producing, I don't think that's necessarily changed so much today. So that's my harsh criticism, is for that alone.
And that's true. And that's entirely true. I will definitely not say that's not true. But it's funny because now after 10 years, I started a conversation with the CEO of Wiley. We only had an email conversation. We're going to start chatting after 10 years. You're absolutely right that for me, the publishing industry and all of the publishers are very similar. The publishing industry is stuck not in the last century, but 2 centuries ago. Now, it's not as if, take Wiley as an example, they made a lot of acquisitions.
They're my publisher too, so maybe they'll kick me out.
They're doing things, but again, I think it comes back to how serious, how strategic is innovation seen, right? So you're absolutely right that I would say it's not an industry I know really, really well, except the publisher I work with. But as an industry, from what I see as a reader, there are no mind-boggling value propositions. Say, okay, ebooks, they're still extremely basic. So if you take our book, it's very visual. It doesn't work on the formats. With a Kindle, you can hardly read our book because it's not a text-based book. The industry didn't innovate. In this case, not even Amazon. The ebooks are terrible from a format perspective. All you can do is make the letters bigger and smaller. Like, how much innovation is that? It is an industry that's completely stuck. And there's so much opportunity. You were mentioning opportunity before. The opportunity is amazing. Why is there no publisher that creates a platform where you can actually interact a lot more in a more interesting way with the author or other practitioners who use the methods from the author? Why does that not exist? That should.
For example, why is not every publisher saying, oh, you want to build a beautiful book for one of the newest iPads, the 12-inch iPads?
Exactly.
Completely different ballgame.
Exactly. And that's, again, it comes back to industries get disrupted when there's one company that moves. Right now, it's still the disruptors from outside. The car industry would be in the same place if Tesla hadn't been so disrupted. They would be in exactly the same place, and we would have no electric vehicles. I'd have no doubt about that. If Tesla didn't disrupt this industry, it would be in exactly the same place. We'd have a tiny, tiny, tiny niche market for electric vehicles, but none of the big players would have said, we're going to move in 5-10 years, 100% electric. It needs a disruptor. But the opportunities are there. That's what's mind-boggling. And I sometimes ask myself, why do the big ones not shift? And it is a question of also how leaders are incentivized, how their careers are, and the type of leaders that we have at the helm of most companies. They're executors. And I'm not saying this in a dismissive or arrogant way.
They're missing the innovation arm. They don't have it.
Exactly. They're not entrepreneurs. And that's not to say, again, it's super hard to execute and manage. It's already hard enough. But to execute and manage and create the next growth engines, that is insanely hard. You need to be very entrepreneurial. So I think we're going to see a new breed of leaders that are a lot more Jeff Bezos-like, a lot more Peter Ma, Jessica Tan-like. We'll see those emerge, in particular after this acceleration through COVID-19.
The book, The Invincible Company. Alex, where can we send people? Where would you like them to go? You can buy all your books on Amazon, yours and your co-authors. What website would you like people to venture to?
I think it's best if they go to strategizer.com because you can get a lot of free stuff there. If you're still on the fence and you say, well, what's this visual book thing? I don't get it. You can actually get a 100-page preview. We really believe in the freemium model. Get a 100-page preview, form your opinion, and also go more to get some online courses and so. So we give a lot away. That's where you'll find all our stuff, all our thinking. We'll also put the freshest things there because before anything makes it in a book, we publish it on our website.
Alex, thank you for taking the time today. Hopefully, when the next one comes out, there's always a next one with an author team like you guys have assembled. So please keep me posted and appreciate you coming on.
What a wonderful conversation. Thanks for having me.
Mike Dever was my first episode. And now, somewhere in the 800s, he's back on again. Actually, he was on for a second time, I'm fairly certain as well. But wow, so cool that somebody who gave me his time so early on, when this podcast really had 0 people listening, I mean a handful, and Mike, a very experienced money manager, lots of insights, a really interesting Rolodex, Mike came on and gave me his perspective. And now he's back today with one of those great perspectives about the markets, trading, and investing that you need to listen to. It's not the same old, it's a different view. And damn it, if we're looking at the current spring 2020, and you think you don't need a different view, if you think the game is the same old game, you got something wrong with you. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my conversation today with Mike Dever. I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing fine. Yeah, I mean, it's been a very interesting time, obviously. And right now, I mean, the silver lining is I got all 3 of my boys home for a little while, so we get some good family time.
You're outside Philly, is that right?
We are outside Philadelphia.
Yeah, right before I called you, I was thinking, well, I know just from memory, you've been on the show a couple times, but I was thinking Mike had to have been in the first 10 episodes, and I quickly pulled up my own website because 856 episodes in, lo and behold, you were the first episode. I had forgotten.
That's right. That's a little badge of honor because people will ask me, have you listened to Mike Covel's podcast? I'm going, oh, yeah, I was the first episode he ever did. I've always got that now, if nothing else, right?
That's very cool, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Let me take people back in time a little bit. How long have you been working with clients in the managed money space?
Since 1982.
1982. That's a wide cross-section of market cycles and events, unexpected things, crises, booms, busts, bubbles, pops, corruptions, who knows what. You've seen the full landscape, haven't you?
I've seen a lot. Yeah, it's been very interesting times.
What do you think about from a market perspective? I just saw what a lot of fund managers did for the month of March, specifically some of the ones that happened to be in my books, and they had a pretty damn rocking month. How do you perceive what's unfolding here? And we don't even have to get into trading strategies yet. We can kind of just look at the markets, and you can give some philosophical background about how you see things unfolding and offer some pearls of wisdom. We'll pick it apart over the next hour, but give people some ideas about how you see it with all that experience in the managed money field.
There's some things that are very different from what I've ever seen before, and then there's a lot of things that are highly similar. For me right now, I mean, obviously the difference is the whole fact that there was an event that's triggered global recession, a global slowdown. In the past, those events have been more specific to different geographies. Obviously 9/11, it didn't affect the entire globe the way it affected the United States. And this is the first time where we see something where it's truly affecting the entire world. And I've seen some people misclassify the recession that's being triggered by this as an event type recession, which generally implies that it's going to be shorter in duration, shorter in magnitude, nice recovery, and every setback is a buying opportunity for investors. And I just totally disagree with that. I think this is something that's more like a depression scenario where you have behaviors that are going to change for a generation. Not only that, but you've got immediate economic impact that's going to be global and wide reaching across not just geographies, but industries.
Not that you have perfect foresight or any way to predict what will happen next, but you've just laid out close to 40 years of managed money experience. And for those people listening out there that might have that kind of V-shaped recovery in their mind, which is what all the politicians want to talk about, you're really telling people right now that you're sitting around thinking you're going to buy a dip and get back to all-time highs in a stable sort of way. That's probably not so wise, huh?
Absolutely. You talk about politicians wanting that V-shaped recovery, and they're talking about it, and everybody's being enthusiastic about the recovery and how it's going to snap back. It's prevalent across the entire financial industry. Just over the past week, I've been canvassing the different large investment banks, the Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, Wells Fargo. So far, the most bearish forecast I've seen is a 4% rise between now and year end. That's bearish. The most bearish person is predicting the market to be higher by year end.
What is the feel? Because you, being in the space for so long, you've got an interesting Rolodex that a lot of people are not going to have. Are there particular stresses? And I'm thinking back to the fall of 2008, because there was a moment in time, September or so, where I kind of felt like, damn, are they going to turn the ATMs off? What are you hearing and feeling? Does it feel like the banking system is solid this time around?
We came in with much better in the way of capital ratios, and obviously interest rates are low for the economy to be able to borrow. But that's just built up so many imbalances that for right now, for example, just this morning, I'm watching the news talking about the mortgage industry in the U.S., and people aren't really focusing on what is happening there to the extent that it's the negativity. But a lot of these people that are getting these deferrals of their mortgage and payments and interest, I mean, that's just going to go through the entire industry, just kind of trickle down until it has to get backstopped, because there's going to be, the industry wasn't built for that. And it's mostly the mortgage servicers right now that you see trouble with. But it's not that different from what I saw in 2007 and early 2008, when you started seeing a little bit of a ripple here and there of trouble, and then it started into a cascade. We're at that point where we could have that same kind of cascade. And I'm just talking about the mortgage industry right now and the banking industry, which came in relatively sound. But there are a lot of excesses. Corporate debt has increased as people have taken advantage of low interest rates. I think you've got a lot of potential troubles as people start seeing the economy slow.
I mean, if you take, for example, everyone, I'm just generalizing there, but if everyone skips a payment or delays a payment or whatnot, as you say, that trickles down. And okay, eventually perhaps the government says in some way, I don't know how they exactly do this, but we're going to backstop it all. We're going to kind of carry people over this 1 or 2 months, assuming it's only 1 or 2 months. But then again, even if the government somehow or another was able to vacuum everything up, I mean, there's going to be a price, a cost for all this. There's just, to me, I mean, look, I'm not a prediction guy. I'm not trying to say I got some kind of fundamental expertise here, but this just seems ominous.
I agree. I made a comment in a Bloomberg interview about 6 years ago. This is more the tail end of QE indefinite type of behavior, that really what these governments are doing is engaging in what would have been considered a Ponzi scheme by just continuing to throw money to bail things out. That hasn't ended. And it's almost as if at this point they've gotten so comfortable with being able to throw money at something that they don't believe there's going to be any consequences. Maybe I'm totally wrong and there won't be. But the fact that the U.S. government just passed $2 trillion in a matter of days, where they were fighting for months over $5 billion to fund a border wall, is just unbelievable to me. It's so easy for them to spend that kind of money that quickly and without really even knowing exactly how it's going to happen. There's going to be consequences. There has to be consequences at some point. But right now, it's just not in the cards. As long as the Fed keeps holding rates down and this money can be funded cheaply and companies continue to borrow cheaply, I think you don't have a day of reckoning. It keeps getting pushed off.
You had this nice, not altogether straight line up, but we get to the bottoms of March of '09, and all of a sudden behind the curtain, the Wizards do a few things, and the next thing you know, we didn't really have to pay much of a price in many ways for the real estate crisis of '07, '08, '09. I mean, just we all kind of watched the Big Short movie, and then when it was over, I was like, oh, everything's over, everything's fine. But something started building up, as you kind of hinted at. I think what's really interesting about Corona hitting right now is a lot of people just want to talk about, especially, again, the politicians, they want to talk about just Corona and this one thing. Of course, it's awful, but this one thing out of nowhere. But it's kind of one thing, a trigger out of nowhere, hitting a system that was about as goosed up as you could possibly get it, wasn't it?
Well, that's the interesting part. You've had people talking about how much better condition the economy's been in, banking industry, going into the Corona crisis than we had previously with, say, 2007, 2009 period. The reality was we really did juice the economy globally with easy money, with tax policy. What did we get out of that? Global growth in developing countries that was 1% to 2%. I just don't understand how people consider that to be on solid foundation. When you look at the stock market, what people were paying and the PE ratios increasing, and you kind of just break it apart into simple components and you say, okay, so you've got out of the earnings that corporations have been making, roughly half, a little less than half of that has gone out to dividends, and the other half has gone to share buybacks. They've been borrowing to generate growth and investment. That's only been possible because rates are so low. But now you've got indebtedness in the corporate sector that's at record levels. There's a lot of things that aren't right. People will look back probably in 2 or 3 years and go, oh, that was obvious. But right now, nobody's even talking about it.
I said that you've got an interesting Rolodex. We don't need to name drop it all, but if you were to call some of your buddies and you're not talking to me here on the podcast so everyone can listen and you're just kind of talking amongst each other, do you have a gut level feel if the government's going to be able to tidy this one up fairly quickly? Or do you have a feeling that this is more of a 2000 to 2002 or 73, 74 couple year or longer event?
I definitely think it's a couple year or longer event. Going to be a reactionary kind of policy that we see taking place. Something happens, the government steps in and patches that. Something else happens, they jump in and they patch that. There's nothing, you just see it in their tone and what their optimism, what they want to believe rather than what is objective and what is actually occurring. They want to believe that what they're doing at each level as a reaction to what occurred is sufficient. As they find out it's not, they'll do something else. But there's no plan to make it solid out of the gate and doing really sort of what if scenarios. And the other thing is, why does it keep falling back to government? I mean, that's not the role of governments, is to bail out economies. That didn't used to happen. But again, it's what I talked about 6 years ago, this Ponzi scheme mentality that's really gotten emboldened over the last 20 years as government found out, wow, we can throw money and we can make these policies. We can buy up trillions of dollars worth of debt and fund it through our own purchases as long as we keep rates down. So they've got that mentality that they can keep this ball rolling. But I do believe at some point, the reactionary policies and the just continuing to buy up debt and issue more debt to be able to pay and patch things over, there has to be at some point how it comes home.
So we lay out kind of the scenario and people can easily see that it's a little pessimistic. And that's kind of the lay of the landscape. But you've got this entrepreneurial attitude. You've had it for a long time, lots of different ventures. Again, fund manager for a long time. Why do you have this entrepreneurial attitude? Why?
A number of years ago in the financial crisis with my brother, who's an architect, and he said there'll be a lot of obstacles thrown in the way, but people like us, he's saying, and there's just tens of millions of us in the country that are entrepreneurial, will always find a way. You don't find the way by just being optimistic. I'm optimistic that there will be solutions to things, but you have to be objective. I think it's a combination of from my standpoint of looking at things objectively and trying to figure out how I can surmount the problems that are there or take advantage of problems that are out there with my business and what I do with my actions.
I remember back during the real estate crisis, everyone was talking about low unemployment. And then overnight, we were at 10%. And again, the same kind of thing. I wonder, after having two of these lose your jobs on a huge scale, two events within a decade roughly, if people will reconsider the idea of putting all their eggs in that basket, or will people say, God, I really don't want to be caught. And this is why I was asking you about your entrepreneurial perspective, but I really don't want to be caught with my pants down, so to speak, again. Because I think at least if there's a hustle mindset, if there's I'm going to kill something on my own today and be able to drag it home and at least care for myself, that psychological feeling is really important, especially if you've been burned a couple times and believing that the system will take care of you.
I agree. And that's when I mentioned earlier about this more of a generational depression mentality that could take hold here. I really do feel that people will start to say, okay, I don't want to be in a position again where I lose my job and I have absolutely no savings to back me up. I don't have any contingency plan in place for how am I going to survive if I'm not getting an income that's coming in. And you saw that after the generation after the Depression, where people were savers, they were low risk takers. They did everything they could to become as self-sufficient as possible. I think we're going to see more of that mentality. And I'm not talking about people that are building bunkers necessarily, although I think there'll be an increase in that as well. But I think just people that will not rely on someone else to take care of them as much as we've seen. There's been this trend towards socialism. I think there will be more of a trend towards independence following this, where people don't want to be dependent on the social welfare and being provided by others to the extent that they are dependent on that today.
But on the flip side, to take the devil's advocate argument, a lot of people are probably going to be in panic mode if somebody comes along and says, here's your bag of gold just for being a citizen. A lot of people are going to say, thank you, sir. Can I have another?
Yeah, unfortunately, you are correct. As I was saying that, I was also thinking that we've got a certain group that'll be dependent and even become more dependent on being provided for rather than finding their own provisions. Unfortunately, that may mean that instead of bringing people together, this breaks people apart even further.
You mentioned the Great Depression generation, 30s and whatnot, and the idea of becoming a saver after that event. Now, if you start saving, though, that equals less consuming. Less consuming equals less corporate growth. Am I onto something?
Absolutely. I think that's one of the contributors to this having a long tail. I don't see the snapback. People talk about the snapback after the financial crisis. We really had a year or two of strong growth before it went into more of a long-term malaise for the last decade with that moderate 2.5% GDP growth, and that's in the U.S. Obviously, other developed economies were doing even worse. But that snapback was because of pent-up demand for housing and for autos, which come to the two main areas. I don't see that same pent-up demand in this cycle. What I do see is more of that saving and retrenching that'll take place. It'll just cause that longer tail and more of a drag on the economy for a number of years.
I'm jotting down on a piece of paper here, March 2020, and I talked about it at the top of this episode, some of your background and folks that you know in the industry. So if you kind of look back over the decades, your style of trading, friends that you know, their style of trading, it wasn't exactly a surprise. It really wasn't for myself either, but it really wasn't a surprise that when they lifted the blindfold off of March 2020, that a certain style of trader was standing there with gains who probably did not even want to raise their hand and say, we did well. Given the totality of what's going on across the world, no one really wants to hear of a winner when everybody else is doing bad. But it really wasn't a surprise to you in March of 2020 that there were winners and you knew who they were.
Right. I mean, you obviously had some huge trends that took place. This great increase in volatility that you had definitely benefited managers who had a long volatility outlook or momentum type traders. The guys that got damaged were ones that were playing some sort of either sort of an arbitrage type play or reversion to mean type strategies that have worked so well for the last decade, where things just always kind of came back into line. And this totally flipped the types of winners and losers that we had had over the last decade.
Speak to your view right now. Again, there's a lot of different strategies in your background and whatnot, but your particular view of the last handful of years and how you've been helping clients, the mindset or the perspective that you came at, and I'm going to let you explain it, but if I had to kind of generalize, I would say you looked at the industry as a whole and you said, okay, most people are long only, they're buy and holders, but they also have a memory of a couple 50% drawdowns in stocks in the last 20 years. Can I give them something that can mitigate that when something like a March 2020 happens?
Right. So I guess you could say we've had two stages in our thinking over the last decade, and the most recent just shifted over the last year or two. That originally, going back 40 years I've been in the business, our focus has been on providing non-correlated strategies to investors and investment programs that could profit across a variety of economic conditions. They didn't have any particular condition or environment where they necessarily really kick butt. It was designed to be broadly diversified globally across multiple return drivers. So what that did was provide reasonably consistent and reasonably predictable, and you always have to use the disclaimer, nothing's consistent, nothing's predictable, but returns across a variety of environments. And we thought that was the best way we could help people diversify their portfolios. What we saw over the last decade was less and less interest in that approach. And as the U.S. market dominated the world markets and outperformed virtually every other market globally, that's where the money kept going. And it reinforced the belief that all you needed to do was put money into the U.S. market, you bought it, and you held on to it. To the extent that that is just absolutely prevalent even today, where people are looking and saying, is this the time to buy more? Not, should I be concerned about what might happen over the next 10 years? What we did last year, and it grew out of a consulting project we had with a large family office client, is we developed a approach that combines what people want to have, which is this long equity exposure, with put protection against it in the event something like what just happened occurs. Then we pay for that with what we refer to as our alpha overlay. It's a return driver based overlay, which is the trading we've been doing for the last 40 years. So it gives people a product that allows them to have that long exposure. It's what we define as a better way to buy and hold. They still get that long exposure, but it's protected on the downside, and the protection is paid for by the globally diversified return driver-based trading that we've been doing.
Were your people happy with what you did for them for March of 2020?
Absolutely. I mean, it's performed exactly as we laid it out. When we first started presenting it to people, they would say, it can't be possible. All we're doing is options math with modern portfolio theory, which is diversifying a portfolio. We always like to tell the people it's not magic, it's just math. Once we lay it out and they can see it, a portion of them understands it and can accept it. But there's still just a large contingent out there that believes the only way that they should be investing in is buying and holding stocks, and that means U.S. equities. And I can explain why that is, but buy and hold U.S. stocks and essentially do nothing else to diversify their portfolio aside from maybe a spattering of fixed income.
How have you, well, let me say it this way. On the upside, I want you to explain a little bit more, but you buying puts costs money, takes away from something. You got to pay for that. On the upside, though, is any of the upside of this structure that you've put together limited by the put cost?
So the way it works is if you have 100% long equity exposure, you start with that. You buy put protection against that and just naively assume you're buying 1 year leaps at the money each year. That cost, assuming there's no value ever provided by those puts, the raw cost on that averages around 5% a year. So then let's look at it and say, okay, now we can let's try to pay for that put protection. The normal way that people do that is staying within the box, and they might sell some more further out of the money of puts to collect some premium, sell some calls, they caps their upside to collect some premium to help pay for that. All we're doing is saying, no, we want the put protection to be purely there to protect against the downside. And then what we do is we overlay the future strategy that we've applied globally for the last 40 years on top of that. We set that up to pay for that put protection, which requires to generate, say, that 5% annualized return. The end result is what we call risk replacement. We have taken the risk required to earn the 10% annualized return on the S&P, for example, and we've replaced that with the risk required to earn 5% to pay for the put protection. And we've paid for that with a more diversified portfolio than just the S&P. So if you just look at it mathematically, conceptually, we've taken half the risk to offset the entire risk of owning the S&P 500. That in itself is just sort of the math behind why it works. And then when you combine it with the fact that the put protection actually doesn't cost 5% a year, because there's years where it pays off, like this year, for example. And just the put protection alone, if you put that on with the S&P, only reduces the top return of the S&P by about 1% per year. And that's going back we base back over 29 years to early 1990s. You're not really giving up a whole lot, even buying those puts, but you're taking that 50% drawdown, for example, in the financial crisis, and turning that into a 20% drawdown with the naive put protection. So mathematically, it's just something that makes a lot of sense. You layer in the alpha, not only you're paying for the puts, but you're actually enhancing returns over time. So you end up with a risk return profile that's about a third of the risk as measured by drawdown, with return that's actually in excess of what you would have with the S&P alone.
So this was often one of the messages you would hear from the CTA, quant, futures, trend following managers is like, take some of us and put it into that portfolio. But it's obviously, everyone knows it's never really reached the point that it should to have all the advantages for the people that need it. So it looks like what you've done is sat back and said, how do we take all of these smart things that I just rattled off? How do we take these smart things, put it in applesauce for people that just want to stay in their lane with the buy and hold and index and whatnot, and give them something that tastes nice, and they don't really have to consider whether or not they're adding in strategies that they don't, quote, understand and all that?
That's absolutely correct. Because what we've found, investing is not a rational process for people. It's an emotional process. And when I wrote my book a decade ago, that's really the underlying theme through that, is that people invest emotionally. They're not rational creatures when it comes to investing. What we were preaching as an industry, and the managed futures industry was preaching, was you can diversify your risk by adding some of us to your portfolio. What you found was that the emotional person on the other end that was buying stocks was constantly comparing the components of their portfolio, not the overall benefit. And they would say, well, geez, I'm making 15% a year here in this stocks portion of my portfolio, and this futures stuff over here, it actually lost money last year, or in the last 3 years, it's flat, or it's only contributed 3%. I don't need that. That's a drag on my portfolio. That's not beneficial. They've consistently concentrated larger and larger percentages of their portfolio to that long equity component until it's dramatically dominating the performance of their portfolio. What we did was say, we recognize that. That's how they're going to behave. We put together a product that gives them that long equity exposure, but protects them at the same time, and then pays for that protection and provides that additional portfolio diversification that's been preached all along, but people can't follow. Why we call it a better way to buy and hold, because it still gives them that buy and hold in their portfolio, but combines it with things that they should have been doing all along, but they can't do on their own.
I've got an audio cassette with you, and I can't remember who was on the panel with you, but I think it's from like 1992 in Chicago. And I think I saw you speak somewhere 94, 95, 96 in Chicago. And you sound exactly the same. You've been on this podcast multiple times, and you sound the same. You sound like you're 30, okay? You sound even-keeled. What do you do? Sometimes you talk to folks, and you can kind of tell they're kind of tuned out on life, or they're not even-keeled, or something's a little bit amiss psychologically. I'll tell you a funny story. I was doing this podcast last week, and I had a guy on, a professor. I rattled off some statistics, and I wasn't putting any judgment on the statistics. He got upset, called me a name. I had to hang up on him first time ever in my podcast. Here's where I was going before that side tangent is back to you. Why do you have this even keel? What is it about you? What do you do in your life? What's your routine? Why are you Mike?
I don't know. I've always been, I guess, as you say, pretty similar to how I am today. Early on, started developing some of my own philosophy on how I wanted to do my business and how I wanted to live my life. And I haven't really had anything that impacted me that's caused me to deviate from that. It's only reinforced it more. When I look at people that are successful, some of them are emotional and just got lucky, but a lot of them are just, I don't know, I want to say plod along, but they have a pretty stable path they follow. They're not wild. They're not driving the fast Ferrari necessarily. They're just they have an approach and they stick with it. I've had a belief. I've had an approach. I stay with that. I've been fortunate to have a great family and just who I grew up with, my brothers and sisters, and now with my wife and 3 boys. Everybody's always been supportive of me. I think it's just been a great environment that I've grown up in.
Give me some influences. We'll stay in the trading, investing space. Influences either up close and personal for you or influences that were reading, studying influences. Who and what shaped you?
I early on was fortunate to be able to bump into some people who became legendary in the investment business and well-deserved. I mean, they did some great things and not just made money for investors, but outside of investing world. Early on, I met John Henry at one of the early conferences. We spent some time together. John's obviously gone on to some great successes, just had a philosophy, stuck with it. It worked well for him for a number of years. Guys like Paul Jones, who I allocated money to. Paul had less than $1 million trading his own money when I first met him in the early 1980s. He was just the guy that in his 20s, you could just feel the maturity that he had, the ability and the approach that he had that was so disciplined. And I just remember seeing him on Barron's had like a round table every year and talking about his views on the market. I'd get his statements and he might have an opposite position on it. I don't think he was talking against it. I think it was just a week before when he was on the panel, he had a view, but he changed it. So he had the flexibility. He never got locked in as other experts would into a view they had. And I wrote about that in my book about how experts generally are about a third right. It's well documented. There's been a lot of studies on this. And it's because they get locked into a view that they've publicized. They have to stick with it, even if the circumstances change. It should change their viewpoint, and they don't. As much as my core beliefs have always been the same, on a day-to-day basis, I'll allow for that flexibility.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That was not to go back to my little story about having a guest problem, but that was part of the problem because I was just sitting there asking questions and trying to dig into the data. I all of a sudden realized, oh, I guess he's kind of tied himself into this box. If he goes outside the box that goes outside his book, you could kind of just feel like he can't go there. Whereas you just said, okay, Mike saying to Mike, yeah, I've got my core beliefs, but I'm open. And I think that's such a nice way to go through life, to be open. I would hate to be in a situation where somebody was saying, oh yeah, that guy Mike Covel, he can't really talk because he's wedded to this and he's in this box. And if he leaves that box, something bad happens. Exactly where you're going, which is just to be intellectually honest.
Right. I think that's so important. I do change. I used to have a comment when people would be looking at our strategies and asking us how we traded. And I'd say, look, when we develop something, I'm 100% sure that I'm right. But my beliefs on each of these different strategies probably have a 2-year half-life. So I'll believe that. But if I'm proven wrong, we'll change. We'll adapt to that. And I would find fairly regularly that maybe my initial thought that I was so convinced was right, 2-3 years down the road, I start realizing, you know what, I was off on that one. And you need to have that flexibility at that sort of lower level of trading strategies and investment concepts and ideas, because the environment does change. But overall, you have to have that overriding philosophy that's consistent. And I think that's what I've seen in some of the 2 traders I mentioned earlier. That's what you could see in them. They had a consistent philosophy. even though they may be prepared to change their viewpoint even week to week in the case of Paul Jones, based on changes in the environment and the markets that he was looking at.
It's an interesting point you bring up about those guys because they were both in their early 20s. Maybe John was a little bit older, but that they had that gusto and that understanding and people believed in them at that age. Whereas I think today, a lot of people have kind of created this teen, 20, 30 something that just kind of goes on forever. And no one has to kind of stand up and be counted and show some maturity and actually say, you know what, I can bite that off and chew it. I'm 27 years old. I can do it. Whereas people say, no, he's only 27. He's too young. There's really been a mindset change, I think, since when you grew up.
The only place you see that old mindset, I guess, is in the tech industry.
Yes.
Where people are revered the young age and having that innovation and running with it. In finance, it's really gotten to the point where there's only a few beliefs that people are firm in. And one of those is that buy and hold belief. The fact that you just buy and hold and the market goes up. It's been reinforced over time. And I mentioned earlier that I would explain why that belief is so prevalent in the U.S. If you look at the global markets, and I had written about this before, if you go back to 1900, where you had 3 dozen global markets that were existent at the time and actively traded, only 4 of those survived to the end of the 20th century without a major disruption or total loss of investor capital. The U.S. was one of those. Australia was one of those. There were just a handful. The reason today that buy and hold is just such a firm belief in the United States is because that has worked since it's been preached in a very powerful way. And every setback has reinforced that you should not sell because 2-3 years later, if people sold at that bottom, which is when they sell, that would prove to be a mistake. But if you look at other economies, you could just start rattling them off. I mean, starting with Japan, which is now 50% down from 30 years ago peak. France, you've got the UK now, all these markets that are lower than they were prior to the financial crisis. Australia, China, Hong Kong, Singapore, Spain, Italy. I mean, you can go through dozens of different stock indexes and markets that are lower than they were 15 years before. Those people aren't preaching buy and hold. Buy and hold, it's not a proven philosophy. It's just an observation. In the U.S., if you look back, you should have just continued to buy and hold. It doesn't mean that's the right thing to do now going forward. That's where people aren't thinking. Is the environment different today? And what I wrote about before was buy and hold, even in 1900, with those 36 stock markets, those countries, only 4 of them survived intact. That doesn't support buy and hold. It only supports buy and hold for those 4. But even in those 4, are the environments, the baseline conditions that you had for those 4, similar to where they were in 1900? Well, the U.S. was an emerging economy with $16 billion GDP in 1900. It's 1,000 times bigger than that today. Is the same baseline condition, is the belief in why you should buy and hold then, does it apply today? Think about that going forward. I could argue both ways, but the fact that there's not just one way to argue it means that you really need to be thinking about doing something else with your portfolio than committing a vast majority to buy and hold.
The other thing there too, and this is not something a lot of people are either trained to do or want to do, but the opportunity cost. I mean, if you throw it all in now April 2020, throw it all into quote buy and hold, some of the issues that you've brought up in this conversation, you really got to say, are there going to be better opportunities in the next 5 to 10 years than just trusting buy and hold? And I think that's what you're really getting at is sometimes there are these paradigm shifts. Maybe this is not one, but it sure as heck is something. I mean, this is just not normal at all. I mean, everyone could look at the quote unemployment numbers. I mean, it's off the charts. This is just one of these events that is like we have no one living has a prior experience in anything like this.
Right. I mean, employment numbers are order of magnitude off the charts from what we've previously experienced as an extreme. The problem you have, I think, is that people they've narrowed their investment beliefs and focus, I guess, now to either I'm long equities or I'm long fixed income. And we're back into that sort of very primitive thought process right now. So just yesterday, I was talking to a financial planner who's saying that I have to keep people in stocks. We have to be buying more stocks because there's no place else to go. And I've been hearing this for the last decade.
Hold on, that's how they get paid.
They do, but he's now, because he's fee-based, he's now making a third less than he was making because he's put so much money into equities and they've gone down. So he's got less money to work with and get paid on.
It's more of an issue of just bad strategy.
I think it is because they don't look at the other opportunities that they have available. I talked to an elderly investor, 85 years old, who's got all his money in equities. His comment was, well, I can't take it out of there because I won't make money anywhere else. And my comment to him was, well, what happens if you don't make money in that? What happens if you do have a Japan scenario and for the next 30 years, it's still half of what it is today, 30 years from now? That would change everything. Because prior to that, he was saying, I'll just ride out any drawdown, any sell-off. I'll ride it out. I at least got him to start thinking that maybe, even if you're not going to look at the other things that are available to you, you just put it into cash. That may make you 30% because you would have lost 30% in equities. Maybe. But you at least have to consider that. Right now, the consideration is not out there for that.
That was very slick how you just did that. I'm sure a lot of people did not catch that just by being in cash, you'll make 30%. What do you retrace that one for people?
Well, they don't think of what they might give up or lose by maintaining the investment. They just are looking and saying, what if I move that investment? What am I giving up? And in their head, they're getting a return. It's just postulated that they're going to get a return on that equity investment. But what I'm trying to get them to think about is, what if that's not the case? What if it does go down 30%? Being in cash just saved you that. It made you that 30%. That's the only thought process I'm trying to get them to make. I'm not trying to make them leap to, okay, you could do these globally diversified portfolios across return drivers, and there's all these other ways that you could diversify your portfolio. I'm not even trying to get them to make that leap. I'm just trying to make them at least see that there may be a risk that you can offset by moving out of that other long equity position.
Go into your alpha hedge strategy right now. Go into it in the sense of just the quick example of, we've had these two S&P 50% downs. Perhaps we're in the middle of a third right now. Who knows? But we've had these two S&P 50% downs. How did your alpha hedge, going back and looking at it, how did that perform during that period? So this, again, is somebody who's just index, S&P, they took the 50% hit. If they would have gone with your mindset that you're employing, what would have been the alternative?
Again, just with the naive approach of buying those one-year puts at the beginning of each year at the money, in the financial crisis, you would have turned that 51% drawdown, and this is on the total return index, dividends reinvested, in the S&P into a 17% drawdown in that period. The advantages, and that people are, I think, starting to understand, is what that means is instead of having 104% return to get back to even, after that 104% return, you're up over 60% in your portfolio if you've mitigated that drawdown. Just the mere fact of reducing loss increases your returns. All that's just proven out from the put protection that's in the portfolio. And like we say, it's not magic, it's just math. The math is there, it supports that.
Have you become a lot more popular now after March of 2020?
We have a few different Zoom conference calls today. We've got tomorrow. We're starting to talk to people more than we have. What's interesting is the response. We started out, I guess I'll call it preaching, the virtues of this approach to people towards the end of last year. And our approach to them was, look, this bull market's long in the tooth. It's at record length. PEs have been extended. There's some reasons why maybe you want to help protect your portfolio. And we explained how this would help them protect their portfolio. Nobody really bought into that because they didn't think they needed to. If you could just buy and hold, you ride out any drawdown. Why protect against that drawdown? Today, we're seeing what's really interesting is nobody wants protection. They feel the damage has been done. If anything, they're looking, should I add more to my portfolio at this point? That is universal. It's unbelievable how universal that viewpoint is. Nobody, as I mentioned earlier in this, nobody's looking at the downside. They're just saying, what is the upside? And the most bearish scenario that we've seen yet on the street is a 4% rise from current levels by year end. Not a decline. increase. That's the bearish case. It's unbelievable. So what we're seeing now are people that are saying, okay, can you protect me if it does happen? There's some probability of that. I understand that. But I want to make sure I catch this rise that's going to occur here. What we've been pitching more now is how the diversification that we embed in this portfolio through the alpha overlay can enhance your returns over time. So we're not talking the put protection because people don't think they need it now. They think that's been done. The horse is out of the barn. It's crazy, but we're back to talking portfolio diversification.
I still remember too, when the dot-com bubble burst, I think March of 2000, there was a lot of that kind of hanging around and whatnot. And it wasn't until the fall of 2002 that I really see people throwing their hands up and saying, gosh, I've got to look at something different. You really needed to get that NASDAQ down 77%. And then people were all of a sudden like, hey, okay, there's got to be something else out there. And then, of course, we goosed the system back up to get us to the real estate crisis. So it will be interesting to see how things unfold, huh?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think right now there's just so much bullishness. It's weird to say that when there's so much fear going on right now. But when you actually ask people what they're doing with their money, they across the board believe the best thing to do is either ride it out or buy more.
There you go. Mike, you're offering a different message than that. If people want to find you, check you out, have a conversation, check out what you're up to with your firm, where can we send them?
They can go to brandywine.com, or a second alternative is we have a brief video talking about what we're doing with Brandywine Alpha Hedge at abetterwaytobuyandhold.com.
abetterwaytobuyandhold.com. Easy enough. A little long, but easy enough. Easy to remember.
Yeah, very good.
Mike, listen, I appreciate it. Again, guest number one, now guest in the 800s somewhere.
That's impressive. You've done a great job, Mike.
Hey, thanks again, Mike. Hopefully we will talk again in the not too distant future.
Thank you very much.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.